My Hero Academia, there's a plethora of powerful quirks, but in my opinion, there's none more interesting than the concept of a half and half quirk, somebody who has the ability to wield two powers at once. And with those videos being some of my best performing ones admittedly, I figured that there was no reason why for the Christmas special, I shouldn't drop a little remastered version of What If Deku had half light, half dark, seeing as I know a lot of you guys found my channel thanks to that video, and I know a lot of you guys are actually going to show some interest in this one. So I figured it was the perfect little Christmas gift for you guys, which I'm really hoping you guys receive it well, seeing as it is Christmas, so a like would be very much so appreciated. But jokes aside, ladies and gentlemen, I genuinely hope you guys go on to have an incredible Christmas, spend awesome time with your family, and you guys just honestly get to live this season to the fullest. But without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
We begin our story with an excited Izuku in the back of his mom's car, just excited to get to school, because the previous day he had just gone to the quirk doctor and he knows what his quirk is, a light manipulation quirk. And seeing as Deku would have been excited to get literally anything and ended up getting this kind of quirk, safe to say our boy is so happy, to the point that when he enters the classroom, instead of being his usual timid self, he immediately jumps onto one of the desks and goes, "I got my quirk!" To which the entire class, now finally giving him their attention, would say, "Oh yeah, and what quirk was it, Izuku? Bet it was a weak quirk," some of the kids would snarl, as Izuku would have a bit of a saddened expression hearing that, and then go on to say that his quirk is a light quirk, beginning to glow brighter than anything in the entirety of the classroom, causing some of the students to have to cover their eyes. It was as if they were in the presence of the sun, which makes Deku apologize, saying that he didn't mean to use his quirk that hard. This is when Bakugo, going over towards Deku, would say, "Guess I was wrong about you, Deku. Looks like me and you are going to be training to become heroes 1 and 2. With Deku smiling at Bakugo, that is, until suddenly Izuku would sneeze, changing everything about the boy in terms of his demeanor and even the way that he had his eyes, because when he was using his light quirk, his eyes were big, wide, and bold. They were like the innocence of a child, but the second that Izuku sneezed, the light within his eyes dulled, with even his eye shape changing a little bit. This is when, getting down from the desk, Izuku would walk out of the way of the crowd, making his way towards the back as to not be bothered, with Bakugo following behind and going, "So Deku, Izuku, what are we gonna do to get stronger?" With Deku just giving Bakugo a look of like, "Leave me alone," with Bakugo picking up on this immediately and being like, "Guess you think you're better than me just because you got your quirk. Well, I'll tell you something, Deku, you're not," beginning to berate him and literally challenge him to a fight at their preschool, seeing as Bakugo already had his little sparks. But in this moment, Deku's quirk would flare up and half of his face would turn into darkness, with the room itself having all of the light sucked out of it almost immediately, leaving Bakugo, who was about to press Deku, to just completely back down, feeling the change in persona that had just happened with Deku. And with him finally giving Deku some space, the room would return back to normal, Deku having some of his hair cover one of his eyes, as I feel like that's just kind of hilarious for his hair to like kind of change a little bit whenever he goes into this mode, with him sitting in the back of the class just kind of staying quiet and out of everyone's way. As the day would finally come to a conclusion and Deku would be outside waiting for Inko to pick him up. While he's doing this is when suddenly a tree would have a couple of like its leaves fall onto the ground that have a pollen in them. I think that's the thing that makes most people sneeze, as Deku would start sneezing like crazy, just being like, "Achoo, achoo, achoo," and it ultimately ends up being just the perfect amount of times, leading Deku to go right back into his light persona, his eyes widening, having that innocence back in them, as Deku would remove that bang of hair out of his face and would rush over towards Bakugo, asking him how exactly they're going to start their training. This would stun Bakugo, would say, "I thought you didn't want to be friends with me, Deku." With Deku being like, "What are you talking about, Bakugo?" Leaving Bakugo to say, "Don't act like you don't know," walking away, leaving Deku completely dumbfounded as to what had happened. That is, until Inko would finally arrive and the teacher would ask to speak to Inko. And this is when a worried Inko would say, "Oh no, is Izuku in trouble?" As she would say, "No, actually quite the contrary. I believe your son doesn't only have a light quirk, but he might have one that has the ability to control darkness. At least, that's from what it seemed like," what Bakugo explained. This is when Inko, looking shocked, would say, "But The doctor said it was just a light quirk, with the teacher smiling, saying that, and that very well still could be the case, but with quirks evolving at the rate that they are nowadays, it wouldn't hurt to just go make sure. So Inko, looking into her wallet and making sure she has just enough money to cover another doctor's visit, she would nod, saying that it might not be too bad, as both of them would get in the car and Izuku would be his normal bright-eyed self. That is, until in the back seat, Deku would suddenly sneeze, and the talkative kid would suddenly just be quiet in the back seat looking out the window, with Inko asking if something's wrong with him, with a sort of monotone Deku now saying that there's nothing wrong, Mom. Inko hearing his voice as she would say, "Are kids picking on you at school or something? Is that why you're acting like this?" Izuku being completely shocked, like, "Mom, I don't know what you're talking about." Her saying, "Even your voice sounds off, Izuku." Izuku like practically beginning to try to swear that he's okay, as Inko would say, no, we can cancel the quirk doctor right now. Tell me which one of those kids is picking on you and I'll go handle it. Izuku being like, "Mom, I'm okay." With her being like, "Are you sure?" And him being like, "Yeah, I promise." This is when finally making their way to the quirk doctor, Izuku would step out of the car almost immediately getting into a sneezing frenzy thanks to the allergies that he has, as he would finally make his way into the quirk doctor's office, now back in his light personality. Inko saying that he seems much better than he was earlier, Deku asking what she's talking about, as finally making their way into the quirk doctor's office, the doctor would check Izuku out saying that he doesn't see any changes and that he's not too sure what could have changed, explaining that after taking a couple of x-rays or whatever the heck they do in order to figure out quirks, he said that his quirk factor has remained unchanged and that he believes that that darkness quirk must have been a part of someone else's abilities. So with Inko saying, "Oh, she understands," she would thank the doctor, as the doctor would say, "Yeah, of course," going on to explain, but just to be sure, he's asked one of their specialists in the quirk office to take a look at Izuku, free of charge. This is when suddenly Dr. Luttrell, shout out Puffin, would end up walking into the room, greeting everybody with a smile, handing Deku a bit of a lollipop, as telling him that he's gonna do a quick scan of him and to stand up really quickly. Deku would say sure, standing right in front of him, as Dr. Luttrell would look Deku up and down, and a bunch of numbers and different graphs and stuff would appear in his mind. This is when he would be shocked, going, "There's no way. This boy truly does have two quirks, one light and one dark." With Deku right on cue literally sneezing once, causing his whole entire persona to immediately start changing. His eyes, his voice, and even that bang that he loves to cover one eye with would immediately change. The doctor saying that's it, as suddenly the quirk readings of the light side had weakened and the quirk readings from the dark quirk had risen. He would go on to explain that he believes that every time that Deku sneezes, he changes into one of his quirks, going on to explain that the reason that this phenomenon must be taking place is because the quirk is far too strong for his body. So instead of inhabiting two quirks that could potentially destroy the boy, it ends up splitting them off, forcing Deku to choose between one or the other, dependent on which personality or persona he's in, the light one or the dark one. Shocking Inko, who would say, "You mean to tell me my baby boy has two quirks and two personalities?" With the doctor calming her down, explaining that it's not as crazy as he explained, going on to calm Inko down, assuring her that this quirk is sure to make her son an incredible hero, and with Deku hearing that, even in his dark side, a smile would appear on his face, saying that he's going to be the greatest hero there ever will be. Count on that. With the doctor smiling, telling him that he's sure he will be, before suddenly asking the boy to display one of his quirks' abilities, with Deku saying, "Alright." This is when, sticking one hand out, Izuku would create a ball of darkness, sucking out most of the light in the room, as an orb of energy would flow around Deku's hand, as the doctors and Inko would all be shocked. Deku just kind of sitting there with a smug smile on his face, knowing that this is easy for him, with the doctor saying, "He even has incredible control over his quirk at the age of 4 years old. He's destined to become an incredible hero, man." Inko smiling as she would say, "Looks like you can become a hero, my little Izuku. I'm so happy for you." Izuku accepting a hug from his mother, as he would say that he's happy too. This is when he would then go on to ask, "Are we done here? I kind of want to go home now. I'm hungry." With the doctors being like, "Oh, yeah, sure. Inko, just remember, every time he sneezes, he's gonna be changing personalities. And we're not sure if that's gonna specifically be the drawback to his quirk, but only time will tell. Let us know if anything changes, and if you ever need a doctor to come check out Izuku, call my personal phone number. I'll be there in a jiffy." With him exiting the room and giving them a note that they're free to go. Once home, Izuku would eat, watch his favorite shows, and then just pass out, Waking up the next day for school, as Inko would walk him into the classroom, going over to the teacher as the both of them would start kind of whispering things in the background, with the teacher immediately lighting up, saying that she knew something was up, saying that that's incredible, that she can't believe that she's gonna have a hero of his caliber being one of her students, going on to immediately call to the attention of everybody and calling Izuku to the front, as she would go on to explain that our little Izuku here is a prodigy in the making, explaining that not only does Izuku have that light quirk he already showed off, but apparently he even has the ability to control darkness, going on to tell the class to show them. This is when Deku, doing what he had done yesterday, would show off to the class that he truly does have a darkness quirk as well, with everybody just being like, what? He has a light and a darkness quirk too? That's so freaking awesome! Bakugo, can you believe it? We have two incredibly strong people in the classroom. As Bakugo, staring at the student who had just said that, would be unsure of how to feel. That is, until the teacher would say, alright, well, settle down. There's one more thing that I do want to tell you guys. Because Izuku has such an incredible quirk, his body can't really handle the effects, so depending on which quirk he's using, that's going to greatly impact his personality. So please excuse Izuku if he's overly mean some days, or some days seems kinder than usual. It's all really just a drawback of his quirk. Let's be patient with him, seeing as we're all sure that Deku's going to grow up to become an incredible hero. Deku nodding, as finally making his way to sit down, we would see the young hero be approached by Bakugo, who would say, huh, guess it all makes sense now, Deku. You have two quirks, and I only have one. But don't let that go and get you cocky, because I'll make sure that my one quirk is just as powerful as your two. Walking away, with Deku really just ignoring him. This is when, as the day would go by, Deku would start sneezing and the personality changes would become more and more apparent to everybody, especially the teacher and Bakugo, with the rest of the class taking a little longer to understand Deku's change, but with him growing older, his hair getting longer, and the changes becoming more and more apparent, it would become a gradual change for everybody. Them all kind of understanding to more so just leave him alone because he prefers to be more introverted whenever he's using his darkness quirk, and he prefers to be way more extroverted when using his light quirk. So it'd be kind of strange for Deku because due to his light side, Deku would definitely find himself involved in multiple clubs, multiple different little sports teams throughout the years, and signing himself up for extracurricular activities. And whenever his dark side would come out, it would cause a bit of trouble because some days he would straight up just not want to leave his room or do anything, and the teams that he would be on would have to just kind of accept that there would be some days where Deku's dark side would come out, and yeah, there was just no getting through to that guy. So with that being the case, as Deku and Bakugo would both grow up, they would end up developing a bit of a strange relationship. Bakugo consistently challenging Deku to fights, whether it be his dark side or light side, with him always losing, like it's just not even a contest, and the light side of Deku telling him to try harder and to improve his quirk in this way and in that way, all the while the dark side would tell him to stop wasting his time, calling him a freaking weakling and telling him to give up on even being a hero entirely, because that's just the type of time his dark side would be on. So Bakugo would never quite bother becoming friends, I guess you could say, with Deku, just due to the fact of the difficulty that is maneuvering around this sort of person that is essentially a bad case of split personalities. So with that being the case, Deku's light side would be convinced that they're like best friends or something, all the while Bakugo sort of just feels indifferent and sort of just views Deku as a light post he has to reach, or in some cases, a dark post. That being the case, eventually the two of them would find themselves in middle school, and we would zoom into Deku on episode 1, walking to school as happy as ever, when suddenly a villain attack would stop everything, and Deku, being who he is, would start writing everything down. And I do mean everything down to the last minute detail, with the random extra in the first My Hero episode being like, I know what you are, you're a fanboy. Deku kind of just being like, guilty as charged, as he would go on to say, oh damn, I'm running late for school. Both of his legs immediately lighting up with this light aura as though he was Kizaru, and then rushing to class as fast as possible, blitzing in through the door, with people in the class being like, hey, it's Izuku, what's up, light? With everybody having developed different nicknames for whenever Deku's in a different mode, because now it's just easily apparent for them to recognize. Whenever Deku sneezes and his hair immediately falls down, that's dark. When his hair is up, that's light. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing. And in case some of you guys still haven't recognized what this is based off of, it's from Dragon Ball. For those of you guys that have, y'all are absolute W people. But anyways, continuing forth with the story, this is when the teacher walking inside with the random papers would throw them into the air, being like, I know you all want to become heroes! With Deku and the rest of the class being excited as ever, that is until suddenly Deku would sneeze, and he would tell everybody to shut up already, that they're not going to become heroes anyways, not with those weak quirks at least. Bakugo turning behind to Deku as he would say, "Huh? What was them, you damn nerd?" With Deku simply smirking, going, "What, you want your 1,000 defeat, Kachan?" With his rival's temper flaring up as the teacher would say, Now, Bakugo, you need to calm down. You need to be aware of the fact that Dark just took over." With Bakugo being like, "To hell with that. This guy gets to be some kind of circus freak show and all of you guys just treat him like the greatest person in the world." Deku now beginning to suck out the light in the room as suddenly it would grow darker and a ball of energy would form, him looking to Bakugo as he would say, "Mind repeating that, Katsuki?" As the teacher would say, "Quick everybody, make him sneeze!" Everybody immediately taking out like pollen from these little Ziploc bags as they would throw them at Deku's direction, and suddenly, achoo, 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 would start coming off from Deku, him eventually ending off on Dark, with them all being like, "Do it again!" Until eventually Light would be the one that they would be stuck on, and he would have to hold his nose, being like, "All right, guys, I'm back, sorry. As he would turn to his rival Bakugo, being like, "Sorry, Bakugo, I didn't mean to," holding his nose still as to not sneeze, with him apologizing about the actions of Dark. This is when Bakugo, turning away and rolling his eyes, would say, "Frickin' nut show," with everybody in the class pretty much like being all like, "Oh, it's great to see you, Light," with him ending off the day as good as ever, as he would finally make his way home. This is when Bakugo, staying behind with his goons, would ask what they even see in that kid. Him beginning to complain and call Deku an absolute nut job, with the students being like, "Dude, Light and Dark are awesome. You just kinda gotta be patient with them." As Bakugo would say, "To hell with being patient with them. That damn nerd Deku can't even be called a he. It's a they." With the two goons being like, "Actually, that wouldn't really be the right pronoun exactly, because he's still technically—" "I know that, damn it! Don't lecture me about pronouns, you damn LGBTQ loser!" As looking down at the ground and feeling bad about Bakugo's outburst, we would see one of the goons mumble under his breath, "That was harsh," as Bakugo would be like, blasting explosions off in the hallway, all the while Deku would be making his way home, taking the same path that he would in the original, just cause, plot. With us once again watching as the Sludge villain would appear behind Deku, and Deku looking at that thing as it would pretty much come up in basically slow motion, he'd be like, "So, safe to say you're a villain, right?" As the Sludge villain would say, "Yeah, that's right, and you're about to be my hero, because I didn't know that freak was in town. Now give me your body, kid," the Sludge villain would say as it would lunge one of its tendrils towards his direction, Deku simply sidestepping it, moving fast as ever, with the Sludge villain being shocked, as Deku would aim a finger pistol towards it and shoot a light bullet straight to the direction of the Sludge villain, who being hit by that would be stunned. "Huh? How did that even manage to hurt, kid? What kind of quirk is that?" With Deku smiling as he would say, "I'll tell you if you can survive 10 more blasts," shooting one towards the direction of the Sludge villain, who, pissed off at this, would lunge his entire body at Izuku, who finally now having to uncover his nose in order to use his left and right hand to launch his gigantic light beam attack, we would suddenly see the dude sneeze, with this darkness emanating off of him almost immediately, much like how Sun Jin-woo's shadows come out of him, as it would splatter the Sludge villain all over the walls, leaving an aura of just straight dread in the air, with All Might finally arriving and seeing that the Sludge villain was splattered everywhere and there was some kid standing there giving off some wicked vibes. So All Might, taking note of the situation, would ask, "Hey kid, are you?" As Izuku would get into a sneezing frenzy, just finally thinking in his dark mode, "Damn it," suddenly switching back into his light persona, as finally covering his nose, he would say, "All Might, is that really you?" Talking like this because he has his nose covered, as All Might would be like, "Kid, what was that? Were you responsible for the defeat of the villain?" Izuku saying, "Yeah, Dark probably did it." All Might being confused, like, "Who's Dark?" As Izuku would go on to explain, "Sorry, I'm a bit of a weirdo when it comes to my quirk. See, I actually have two quirks, and whenever I'm using one or the other, my personality tends to do a little bit of a 180. With All Might looking at Izuku and being like, "That's interesting. What two quirks do you have, young man?" With Izuku smiling, saying, "I'll show ya." A bunch of light beginning to emanate off of the body of Deku, as practically blinding All Might, he would say, "Pretty cool, right? It's a light quirk." All Might saying, "Yeah, it's cool, kid. You think you can tone it down a bit?" Kind of covering his eyes and closing them, but still just seeing light. As, Deku would finally shut it off, and All Might would say, "That's a pretty impressive quirk." Deku being like, "Right? I think it's awesome." With the pro hero telling him, "And I'm guessing your other quirk has something to do with darkness, right?" Izuku saying, "Yeah, but I can't exactly use it now. At least, not unless I sneeze. But, if you want to see it, I could could, with All Might being like, no, that won't be necessary. I think seeing that one quirk is good enough for me. Now, you mind helping me collect the sludge villain? Deku would be like, oh, of course. As using his light quirk, he would super speed around the area. Obviously not like a speedster, but he's moving pretty damn fast because when he uses his light mode on his legs and arms, he's capable of moving at incredible speeds. And with that being the case, the sludge villain would get picked up in about 7 seconds, leaving Izuku to give him a bottled up version of the sludge villain, as he would say it was super nice meeting him, asking for an autograph before he goes, which All Might would immediately oblige, noticing that his time limit's about to run out, with him asking one more thing. Hey kid, what school are you going to? Izuku saying, UA, of course, only your alma mater, with All Might looking towards him and smiling, saying, I'll be seeing you there then, young man, jumping off as he would land on a rooftop, and Deku would watch on from the bottom going, so cool. This is when suddenly realizing that he stopped covering his nose and there was pollen covering his entire jacket from, the frenzy of pollen attacks that his classmates had done, Deku would sneeze, making his way home. As looking at the notebook with All Might's signature in it, he would simply smile, eating dinner with his mother in the same monotone way that he always does, with her asking Izuku how was school. Deku would say that he thinks he met All Might today, with Inko saying, you did? Really? Did Light meet him or did you meet him? With Izuku saying it was probably Light considering he has this autograph. Inko would start freaking out going, we gotta treasure this notebook, with Dark saying, and we will. But let's save that for another day, simply putting it on the kitchen table as he would finish up his meal, and we would do a little bit of a time skip, at least to the day of the UA examination, because over the course of the next 10 months, Deku would do what he's pretty much always done, and that is training with both of his quirks. So on the morning of the entrance exam, what would end up taking place is that Deku would end up writing down in his notebook the night before, when he was in his light state, I want to take the UA entrance exam. As Dark would write back, so do I. And Inko, noticing the bit of a dilemma that they were in, she would go on to say that they should just do a bit of a coin flip, with Dark being like, alright, I guess that's fair. As Inko would end up grabbing a coin, flipping it in the air, and he would call tails, with the coin hitting the ground and showing heads. This is when Dark, pissed off as ever, would end up saying whatever, as Inko would grab a little feather and start kind of like tickling it around Dark's nose. This would lead him to sneeze as light would come out. And once that would happen, he would ask who's going to take the test, with Inko saying that he is, saying that they did a little bit of a coin toss since each of them couldn't decide. And so with an excited Light hearing that he was the one who was actually going to take the examination, we would see him cheer as loud as ever as making his way towards his room and grabbing a mask to make sure that sneezing wouldn't be a problem. He would make his way to the UA entrance exam, being led to the mock exam where Deku would be sure that he was going to be facing off against some pretty powerful robots. And with the test almost immediately beginning, Deku would immediately kick things off by turning into his light form, blinding everyone else around him, as yelling back, good luck! He would make his way towards the direction of the first robot near him, smashing his fist straight through the robot, as then leaping towards one of the building and ricocheting off of it 6 different times. Izuku, now in the air, would aim 2 finger gun pistols towards the direction of 2 3-pointers respectively, blasting 2 gigantic bullets towards their direction and leaving holes the sizes of basketballs where they were, stunning not only the people around Deku who were trying to get to those robots first, but even the proctors. Who is this kid, they would ask, all the while All Might would be sitting next to Nezu smiling, with Nezu clapping saying, it appears that he is as strong as you said, as Izuku would continue his slaughter on the robots, rushing to more and more robots, destroying them with light-powered fists, light-powered kicks, and even light-powered beams from his hands, which he has to concentrate on over to do, but I mean, they look pretty damn sick. So as Deku would make his way towards more and more robots, Deku would start using different applications of his light abilities, making his way towards a pile of robots with 5 in all, as Izuku leaping into the air and shooting out light beams from each individual finger. Deku would start controlling the light as though they were whips, sending them flying at the direction of the robots and destroying them entirely. And this is when Deku, finally looking up, would wonder when the 0-pointer was gonna come out, as right on cue, the sound of rumbling would begin, all the while a smirk would appear on Deku's face the moment he would recognize where the 0-pointer was at. So in a flash, Deku rushing to the direction of the 0-pointer, he would arrive there before Uraraka even had a chance to get under the rubble, and with him calling out a named attack that he would have created, honestly just to sound cool, Izuku would say, I call upon the stars and the sun and everything bright, lend me your power, holy judgment! sending a gigantic ball of light straight to the direction of the 0-pointer, as it would completely engulf it and incinerate every single part of the 0-pointer, shocking every single hero who would have been a proctor, because it took Deku like 2 seconds to charge up that attack. And to say it was overpowered would be an understatement. And as Deku would stand there with a smile, he would suddenly hear a voice in the back of his mind calling him a show-off, which would shock Deku because this has never happened before. And in that moment, he could have sworn he heard Dark's voice in the back of his mind. But with the test being over, Izuku didn't really have too much time to harp on this, so making his way home after getting picked up by Inko, she would ask how the test went, with Deku beginning to explain everything that he did during the test, as suddenly he would hear the voice of Dark in the back of his mind telling him that he would have done better, with Deku being shocked and looking to Inko saying that he swore he just heard Dark's voice. This is when Inko, parking nearby, would end up asking if he's sure, with Deku saying that he is. This is when Inko, grabbing her phone and going to the contact of Dr. Luttrell, she would give him a call saying that he needs to make a house call immediately, saying that Deku's quirk might be evolving or something like that. And so, as they would finish their drive home, they would realize that Dr. Luttrell was already there. And it's kind of crazy because bro lives even further than they were, so bro must have been straight up hauling cheeks to get there. And so with both of them getting down the car and saying hi to him and all that stuff, the doctor would go on to immediately scan Deku, saying that they're right, explaining that Deku's quirk factor's finally evolving, going on to say that maybe it has to do with age, his body getting stronger, or maybe due to the control that Izuku now has. But regardless of which one you want to amount it to, Deku's clearly undergoing some sort of quirk awakening, making it so that Deku will someday maybe be able to control both sides of his quirk at once. So as a smiling Deku would start leaping for joy, the doctor would ask him if he could speak to Light, Deku saying that it's no problem at all, breathing in a little pollen he would have nearby, as Deku immediately starts sneezing like crazy and Dark would finally come out. This is when the doctor would examine him as well and would say that his theory's right, going on to explain to Dark what had happened, with Dark saying that he already gets the gist of what happened. The doctor being shocked, as Dark would go on to explain that he sort of had some sort of consciousness when Light was doing his thing during the entrance exam. And not only that, but he actively wanted to interact with Light when he spoke with him, so he understands what's happening. The doctor would say that that's great, going on to tell him that with a little bit more time, they may end up combining or something like that, with Dark saying that it's for the best, regardless of what the quirk ends up doing to him. And so, with Inko ending up thanking the doctor for making that house run as late as she had ended up calling him, the doctor would say that it was no problem at all, going on to finish by saying, in fact, it's an honor, explaining that the fact that he gets to be the doctor of the future #1 hero, it's actually quite incredible. And with Izuku and Inko finally making their way into the house and Deku finishing the day off deep in thought, seeing is now realizing that the day of the merger is finally coming closer and closer, and the day where they'll have access to both quirks at once is now nearing the horizon, Dark would smile, though he would be a little saddened at the fact that he's unsure what that means for him and Light. But regardless of the outcome, he would still go out there and train as hard as possible, using his darkness abilities to try to get stronger than the ones that Light have, because Light and Dark have a little bit of a rivalry where they try to one-up each other as much as they humanly can, and seeing as we didn't get to see the power and abilities of Dark, I'll be showing you guys that pretty damn soon. But I digress. With that being said, eventually the time would come when Dark would finally end up making his way to school, opening the door to his classroom only to see Bakugo and Ida arguing, as a bit of a scowl and like an angry expression would appear on his face. This is when, sitting in the back of the classroom, Dark would silently scroll on his phone. That is until Bakugo would cough out, "So if it isn't the Great Split, looks like we did get paired up in the same class after all. Not like I expected anything less," telling him to watch out and that he's been training way harder than he can remember, saying that he's not the same as he was 10 months ago, with Dark pretty much rolling his eyes and thinking that Bakugo is just more of the same old same old. This is when suddenly Aizawa would end up making his presence known, and Deku would like Aizawa. The monotone expression, the way that he would carry himself, the way that he would give simple orders, Deku likes this guy, and so following his directions to a T, Deku would eventually find himself outside, changed into the UA outfit, where Deku would have the ball tossed to him, Aizawa telling him to use his quirks to throw that ball as far as he can, with the rest of the class being shocked, going, "Quirks?" All the while smiling Deku would say, "It's about time I get to show everybody just how strong I am," coating his entire body in a hockey-like substance, which obviously isn't hockey, it's like darkness energy, as reeling his arm backwards with the purple energy flowing off of it and half of his face beginning to have like that Kurogiri glow effect. This is when Deku, reeling his arm back, would toss the ball as far as he possibly could, it getting a grand total of 900 meters, seeing as it was the daytime and the sun was definitely impacting his abilities. And so as Aizawa would go on to show the entirety of the class the distance that Deku threw that ball, everybody would start freaking out, saying how cool this event's gonna be, as Aizawa would threaten expulsion, all the while a smiling Deku would have his smile interrupted by Light, who would go on to say that he would have thrown that ball at least 3 times further, with Dark rolling his eyes, seeing as Light, more than anybody, should know that his abilities were currently being inhibited by the fact that it's currently sunny outside. Because much like Tokiyami's quirk, Deku's quirk is affected by the sunlight as well. I mean, it is darkness and it thrives in darkness, so yeah. Anyways though, with that being the case, Izuku would go on to complete every single last one of the remaining tests with his darkness quirk, getting incredible scores, actually landing at the top of the class, which mind you, he accomplished even with his quirk being nerfed. And with the test finally being over and people having the chance to walk over towards Deku without feeling like Aizawa was gonna kill them, they would ask Deku what that was, going on to say that during the entrance exam they saw him using a light quirk, asking if it's really true if he has 2 different quirks, with Deku nodding as each of them would say, "That's so sick," you know, like getting into his personal space, making Deku feel a bit awkward. This is when, as Deku would be about to use his quirk to push them away, like, you know, by force, Light's voice would echo in his head, telling him that they're just being friendly and to calm down a bit, with Dark rolling his eyes and just crying out, "Well then you handle them then," as he would force himself to sneeze, and Light would finally come out being like, "Yo," which would catch the class off guard because they're like, "Wait, weren't you just gloomy a second ago?" Izuku going on to explain the way his quirk works and saying that he has 2 sort of personalities inside of him, saying they'll have to excuse Dark, moving the bang out of his face as they would be like, "Oh, I guess I can see it now," the class beginning to talk amongst themselves as Todoroki would be staring at Deku the entire time, Deku looking right back at him, as both of them would realize that each of them have 2-toned hair, Todoroki white and red, with Deku having white and black. And with Deku noticing him out of the bunch, he would walk over towards him asking him if he also has a half and half quirk, to which Todoroki would answer by telling him that it's none of his business, simply walking away with Deku feeling a bit bad by, you know, the reply, Dark in the back of his mind telling him that he's a pushover, with Light just ignoring him, as making his way towards the rest of the classmates he would start answering any questions that they have, them all thinking that he's the coolest person ever, until Bakugo would finally chime up saying that he's a freaking weirdo, and sooner or later they're all gonna realize it, saying that Split over here is a walking nutcase, leaving the entirety of the class to be like, "I guess he's kind of right," as Deku would say, "Come on now, best bud, you don't gotta be that rude," as Bakugo would say, "We're not best buddies," as Deku would say, "Don't mind Kachan, he tends to get in a bit of a mood, especially when I'm just changing out of nowhere," with the rest of the class starting to laugh, and Aizawa telling Izuku if he can stay after class. This is when everybody else would leave and Izuku would stay with Aizawa, speaking to him privately, Aizawa questioning him on the nature of his quirk, and asking Deku if there's any need for concern when it comes to him in the class, Deku going on to explain that there shouldn't be, and that other than Bakugo making Dark mad, there's nothing else that he really should worry about, with Aizawa nodding, apologizing for holding him back, as Izuku would finally make his way home. This is when we would get a close-up of Izuku's room, him walking inside as every single thing would be turned on, illuminating the place, with Dark rolling his eyes as he would turn every single little thing off, saying that that's much better, sitting down on the ground as he would begin to meditate and calmly think about the way that today went down, thinking of different ways to make his quirk stronger, when suddenly he would realize maybe being around Light all the time would help it so that that wouldn't no longer be a weakness for him. Instead, it could be a source of strength or something like that, as he would turn everything on begrudgingly before finally thinking to himself, "Nah, he's not doing this," smacking himself in the face with a handful of pollen as suddenly Light would come out, happy per usual, as he would make his way to the kitchen and start snacking on something while watching Zether's latest video, which would happen to be What If Goku Married Bulma, which I just dropped by the way. Y'all should definitely go check that one out after you're done with this one, because I had a lot of fun on that, and I can already tell it's not really going to do that well, so any support on that video would be much appreciated. But self-plug out of the way, let's continue. With the day finally coming to a close and Deku making his way to school for a second day, Deku would sit down in his hero period. When waiting for Aizawa to walk through the door, this classroom would all be shocked seeing that All Might would walk inside in his Silver Age costume. Deku more excited than anyone, seeing as right now he was in his light state, and would yell out louder than anyone, "All Might!" All the while his quirk would start going haywire and light would start emanating off of him. Everybody would start having to like kind of cover their eyes, with All Might being like, "Young Midoriya, do you mind?" Izuku calming down as he would say, "Oh, right, sorry about that." All Might going on to explain that today he's going to be the one teaching them how to be heroes, with somebody in the class being like, "Oh no, does that mean someone else is going to get expelled?" You know, seeing as Mineta definitely would have been expelled in that first day, and All Might would be like, "Oh no, nothing like that," as he would go on to explain that his teaching method is a bit less extreme than Aizawa's, but it will still be fun, going on to click a button which would reveal each and every single one of their hero costumes, with the students all making their way towards the back of the class, taking their costumes and meeting up in the changing room. This is when all of them stepping out would end up leaving All Might to just say, "Haha, well, it appears the clothes make the pros," as he would go on to explain the 2v2 event they're going to be having, with it being heroes versus villains, with All Might explaining that there's going to be a bomb and the rules to win the test. After this would all be said and done, everybody would start drawing their teammates, with Izuku once again getting Uraraka, as he would be paired against Katsuki Bakugo and Tenga Ida, who excited as ever to get his opportunity to try to fight Izuku once again, and in class would think that today's finally the day where he's going to show how much stronger he's really gotten. But before Deku could even get excited about taking part in this is when Dark's voice would ring in his head, telling him that he wants to do this, with Light saying, "Oh, come on though, Dark, I wanted to do that." Dark saying, "Come on, it's inside of a building, that means I'll have the advantage using my darkness powers, you know that," with Dark being like, "Fine." As we would see Deku start to sneeze profusely until suddenly Dark would appear, his bang almost immediately covering his eye, as Dark's eyes would start to like kind of shut a little bit. This is when Uraraka, noting that Deku definitely went into his other persona, would ask if he's Dark right now, leading Izuku to nod. This is when Uraraka would ask, "Alright, well, what's the plan, Dark?" with him turning towards her and saying to simply follow his lead and stay behind. That if she does that, he'll make sure she passes. And this is when, making their way inside of the room, Izuku would go on to smile, noting that in here, Bakugo won't stand a sliver of a chance. Using his darkness quirk to take advantage of every single corner that isn't properly illuminated, to use an ability that he has been recently working on to kind of start tracking what's in the building, and noting that Bakugo was quickly approaching his floor, Izuku would go on to create darkness projectiles that would cover each and every single one of the light bulbs as well as the windows, allowing no sliver of light to enter, or at least not much. So with Bakugo rushing in only to notice that this entire area was completely covered by darkness, he would say, "Did you forget that I have a quirk that counteracts this, you damn nerd?" blasting explosions off as Izuku's voice would ring out from behind Bakugo, who would turn going, "What?" noting that Deku was moving just as fast as Light, which Bakugo hadn't expected, because every previous fight, Dark proved that he was much slower than Light. So Bakugo, being completely caught off guard by this, would suddenly start feeling himself being bombarded by darkness ball attacks, which Izuku would be manipulating within the room, completely making a fool out of Bakugo, who, blasting a bunch of explosions in different directions and trying to just sense where Izuku would be at, he would attempt to land multiple explosions, but they would miss every time. And Bakugo would be greeted to the illuminated face of Deku every single time that a little explosion would crack off his palms. This, however, is when Deku would tell him that he's been waiting to show him a new move, as suddenly this sludgy type of darkness-starch substance would start covering Bakugo's body, first clumping around his legs, then his chest, as Bakugo would attempt to profusely try to pull the pins on his gauntlets. However, in the sound of a swoosh, Bakugo would note that both of his gauntlets were completely jammed, and that black substance was now fully covering Bakugo, who, now completely unable to move, would hear the voice of Deku coming from behind the mask that he would use in order to avoid switching personalities, as Deku would say, "You see the difference between us, Bakugo? The difference is, I'm strong, and you're just not." as he would begin to squeeze his hand, causing the tendrils around Bakugo to start kind of collapsing around him. It's kind of like venom sludge that would be on him. However, as he would attempt to do this to knock Bakugo out and definitely severely injure him, Light's voice would echo in his mind telling him to stop. As he would stop the onslaught, having Loki lost himself to the darkness, as he would yell out to Uraraka, Light immediately returning to the room to follow him. They gotta go take care of the bomb room. Uraraka would do just that, asking if Bakugo's okay. Bakugo completely unconscious, with Deku saying, yeah, he'll be fine. This is when, making their way towards the bomb room, Deku would force himself to sneeze, having felt a little bad that he had lost control in that moment. With Light coming out, kind of having a bit of an uneasy feeling, with him rushing into the building, immediately using his light quirk to just outpace Ida, kicking him square into one of the pillars, as Ida would be knocked out unconscious, and Light would place his hand on the bomb alongside Uraraka, each of them giving each other a bit of a high five, lifting the energy in the room. As Izuku and Uraraka making their way back to the class, they would be praised about their abilities, everybody telling Deku that he's way terrifying when he goes into that darkness state. Deku saying he can be sometimes, as suddenly Tokiyami would go over towards him and ask him to tell him the truth. Did he lose a bit of control when he was fighting within the darkness? With Izuku kind of nodding and Tokiyami telling him not to feel too bad. His quirk kind of has similar effects, with Dark Shadow coming out and kind of fist pumping Deku. This is when Izuku, making his way towards Recovery Girl's office to go visit Bakugo after class, would see that he was actually awake now and looked almost just fine thanks to Recovery Girl's quirk. He would sit next to Bakugo as he would go on to apologize for the way that he fought in that last battle, with Bakugo saying, "What, you come here to tell me you lost control? You weren't able to stop it? Well, save it. I already know that. Now get lost. I don't need you to rub in how much weaker I am than you in my face as well." With Deku walking away, as he would say, "You know, for what it's worth, Dark's sorry too." Walking out of the room, with Bakugo simply just being like, "That damn nerd, such a damn blessed quirk, and he has the gall to say that in my freaking face," thinking to himself that he'll just have to train even harder. All the while we see Deku making his way back home, where Deku would sit in his room just kind of reflecting on what took place, asking Dark if that was normal, who would say that it shouldn't be, explaining that he'd long since gone over that little drawback of the darkness long ago, but maybe he needs to start training on that again. With Light realizing, wait, are we having a conversation? Dark telling him that it looks like it. Seems that their quirks are growing at an exponential rate. And with that little outburst of theirs, he can't imagine it's going to take too much longer for both of them to fully merge into one being. With Light smiling, as Dark would say not to smile too hard, since they don't know what's going to happen to them. Maybe they're going to fuse, maybe they're going to disappear, who knows, but whatever the case is, they're going to be a hell of a lot stronger, Light would say, as Darkness would nod, and Light would say, "Well, let's go to our training grounds," making their way to the same Dagoma beach that they always train in, as they would begin working on everything, developing cool little moves and thinking of even combination attacks that they might do once they finally do merge, with both of them thinking that they're getting stronger every day. Us watching on as Dark would slash at a piece of rubble and some darkness energy would sort of linger, him smiling as he would think that he had finally had a little bit of a breakthrough. Us watching as the voices of Light and Dark would echo simultaneously. Now we're getting somewhere. This is when we sort of flash forward to all of the students on the bus of the USJ making their way to the facility, where they would all almost immediately be met by a bunch of villains, with Deku immediately leaping into action and aiming a finger pistol straight to the direction of Kurogiri, shooting 4 light beams at the villain, with one of them actually managing to hit him dead on his weak spot, with this immediately alerting Deku as to how to attack him, as he would rush in, Kurogiri trying to warp him out of the way, with Deku simply making sly remarks like, "You gotta be faster than that, buddy." Nah, I'm totally kidding, but he would be like, "Too slow." As moving around Kurogiri in multiple different directions, Izuku would continue blasting light beams towards Kurogiri, who eventually, being completely overwhelmed by this, would be forced to warp gate next to Shigaraki, who would ask the villain why he hasn't handled the brats, with Kurogiri explaining that he ran into a complication, a boy with a light quirk that's causing insane problems, explaining that he's too fast to warp away. So with Shigaraki scratching at his neck in frustration, we would watch as he would suddenly stop, saying, "You know what? Why don't we test the Nomu on this brat?" Looking to the Nomu as he would say, "Nomu, kill him." us watching as the Nomu would lunge to the direction of Deku, who would narrowly manage to dodge the Nomu's strike, bending over backwards in a limbo-like state. As catching himself with his left arm, Izuku would bounce himself back up into the air, where he would bring down his leg in a light axe kick, smashing at the Nomu's arm, with the Nomu simply tanking the blow. And this would stun Deku because he's never met an opponent with shock absorption and healing. So when that attack did quite literally nothing to the Nomu, Deku would watch on as a fist would come flying at his direction, but dodging it via blinding the Nomu with his light particles, Deku would manage to narrowly escape the fist of the Nomu, jumping backwards as all 5 of his fingers would aim a laser cannon at the direction of the Nomu, blowing a hole straight through its stomach, with Deku freaking out thinking he didn't mean to. But as he would think this, he would watch on as the Nomu would lunge towards him regardless of the injury, as it would start healing, and Deku would realize, this thing's healing. Leaping backwards as the Nomu would attempt to land strike after strike after strike, but because Deku's faster than the Nomu, he would be capable of parrying every single blow. With Aizawa finally arriving to the fray and telling Deku to get out of here, wrapping his scarf around the Nomu's arm and lunging towards its direction. But the Nomu wouldn't care. It would simply toss Aizawa away like a ragdoll, all the while continuing his ambush on Izuku. So with Deku having absolutely zero time in order to charge up his most powerful attack, which Deku believes could potentially put the Nomu down, he would suddenly hear the voice of Dark in his head, telling him to let him take over. And with Light's mind thinking at super speed of ways that he could potentially beat the Nomu, he would suddenly realize that Dark is the one with the best chance. So immediately forcing himself to sneeze mid-battle, he would do so all the while the Nomu would land a simultaneous punch, sending Deku crashing meters away, with him getting back up and a bang covering his face, signifying Dark's arrival to the fray. And with this new introduction to the fight, Dark would almost immediately hold out a hand in front of him, which would create a cast-like object surrounding his arm which had been hit by the Nomu, seeing as he would have used it to try to parry the blow or at least tank some of it, as Izuku's face would start to turn into this misty black substance, Kurogiri watching on in shock as the energy or light energy in the area would start to get sucked out of there, and all of the light coming in even from the rooftop, which mind you was illuminating the USJ, would start to have its light dimmed, with Izuku lunging to the direction of the Nomu, leaving a crater where his foot previously was, as reeling his one good arm he would leave a slash on the Nomu's chest, which would actually cause darkness energy to start surrounding the Nomu, with it feeling a recoil of damage, because the blow wasn't necessarily intended to leave blunt force attack, but more so a stunning effect, which gives Deku just enough time to charge a ball of darkness in his hand, throwing it directly at the chest and arm of the Nomu, blowing it away, stunning Shigaraki and Kurogiri, who would both attempt to aid the Nomu, with 2 of Shigaraki's hands getting closer and closer to Izuku's face. However, before they could touch him, darkness armor would cover the face of Deku, with Shigaraki's hand hitting something he couldn't decay, and Dark smirking underneath the darkness helmet he had just created, all the while simultaneously holding a hand out and dragging every single thing nearby towards the proximity of this thing, almost like gravity, since darkness was just sucking it towards it like a black hole, stunning the Hero 13, who would watch on saying, "Is that like my quirk?" Watching on as the Nomu being dragged into this black hole type thing would start to have every single piece of its body ripped to shreds, all the while simultaneously the hero All Might would have finally been called thanks to Ida rushing to UA. And with All Might arriving to the scene to see that the Nomu was torn to shreds, he would stare on to the direction of Shigaraki and Kurogiri, who would both warp away almost immediately after recognizing that not only was the Nomu defeated, but now All Might was here. And as we would see Shigaraki landing in the bar, he would slam both fists onto the ground saying, "Master, we weren't told about this brat with a half and half quirk. He used light and darkness and was capable of shredding the Nomu to pieces. How do you expect it to defeat the #1 hero?" With a voice echoing from the TV saying, "Calm yourself, Tomura. This is a simple setback and one you mustn't worry about. Take this lesson and use it the next time you plan to assault the heroes, and next time you'll be successful." Shigaraki saying something like, "Yes, master," as we would see a worried Kurogiri thinking about that high school student who had made a fool of the Nomu, wondering if he's cause for higher concern. However, this would be interrupted by Shigaraki, who would say some random thing, forcing Kurogiri to snap out of it, with us retransitioning back to the USJ and all of the light sources seemingly returning immediately, with Deku hearing a voice in his head more audible than ever, which would be the one of Light going, "Oh yeah, you showed that, Nomu! You tore that thing to shreds, it was so freaking cool!" With Dark kind of smiling, all the while All Might would walk towards him, telling him that quirk of his is incredibly impressive, and thanking him for saving everybody here, with Aizawa arriving shortly after and telling him that what he did was reckless, explaining that he'll have detention once this is all cleared up, with Deku not saying nothing but simply nodding, leaving Aizawa to walk away before stopping and saying, "But I appreciate your help. Truth be told, we wouldn't have survived that encounter, at least not without you. The punishment won't be severe. It's simply to show everybody that they can't leap into action the way you did, because not everybody will have the same results." As Izuku would simply nod, and we would see the school have a 1-week break thanks to the USJ incident, which is where the biggest change in the story would finally happen. Dark and Light would finally have the capability of switching between each other and communicating in a way that they never had before, where now it's not like one person hears the other person's thoughts every now and again, but instead it's like two people are consistently linked. Think conjoined twins. That's pretty much what's happening in this situation, which means that they would now be capable of simultaneously shooting off a light attack followed by a darkness attack, without the comical drawback that I had plaguing them in the beginning. So now, if Izuku truly wanted to, he could blind his opponent by turning his entire body into light before then rushing at them and striking at them with a shadow slash, which paralyzes his opponent via draining his energy thanks to the darkness after effect, meaning that the monster that the UA students are going to have to go up against has just leveled up. But with that being said, with the 1-week break now finally being over, Izuku would return back to class where he would serve his time in detention for 2 days, and eventually the class would be told of the UA Sports Festival, informed of the fact that they're going to be holding the event regardless of what had just taken place in an effort to show a brave face, as everybody would get excited and Uraraka would start, pretty much just going haywire in the class, as it eventually ends, and the students would now make their way outside, Deku almost immediately noticing the large crowd of people, as Dark would immediately take over, telling them to get out of his way before he makes them, letting off an aura of darkness which immediately intimidates the competition, forcing them all to move, as a voice would echo out, "Must be nice to have been born with such an incredible quirk. But don't go and let that make you overconfident. Some general course students might have the capabilities of taking a couple of you out, even if you're not among them." As Shinso would walk away, and Deku would think that this guy's just a reject from the general course, making his way to the cafeteria where the day would finally end. After this interaction would take place, Izuku would go on to be informed that due to the fact that he got the highest scores in the entrance exam, he was actually the one to represent UA, and with Light hearing that, he would immediately switch places with Dark, saying that he can't wait to do this and that he's honored, with us flashing forward to the day of the speech, as we would zoom into a passionate Deku who had just given the craziest speech of his life, with some adults in the stand straight up crying and people starting to straight up celebrate as though the sports festival had just finished. But this is when Midnight would say, "So anyways, the first event is gonna be an obstacle course," with everybody wiping their tears as they begin to cheer on Deku. All the while Deku would close his eyes at the finish line, talking amongst himself as he would pretty much agree that most of the running will be done by Light and any heavy lifting will be done by Dark. And so, with the proctor beginning everything by Midnight shooting the starter's pistol, Deku would be off, immediately darting to the front of the pack as his feet engulfed with light particles would allow Deku to move at speeds at which most pro heroes could only dream of. And as he would eventually approach the 0-pointers, Light would give practically all the control to Dark, who immediately reeling his arm back and landing a darkness slash on one 0-pointer, we would watch as the thing would freeze before suddenly exploding with a heap of dark energy coming off of it. After this would take place, almost immediately Light would take over, saying that's how it's done, before rushing continuously towards the next section. Where on cue, Light would spot that it's a bunch of leaps that he's gonna have to take, so immediately swapping over towards Light, who creating 2 darkness tendrils would end up using them similarly to Black Whip, as he would send himself over into the air, immediately slapping back into Light mode, where shooting 2 beams of light out of the back of his palm similarly to Bakugo, he would blast off in front of the competition even more so, leaving Todoroki and Katsuki in his dust, eventually making it to the mine section, where we would see Izuku running through the mines faster than they can explode on him, crossing the finish line with everybody just cheering on for their favorite student in Class 1A. And with this all finally being over, we would see a horde of students rushing towards Deku, all practically begging to be on his team, seeing as that performance that he just displayed left Bakugo and Todoroki, who each were some of the strongest in the entire festival, in the dust. And with that being the case, Deku would have a breeze choosing his teammates and eventually passing the cavalry battle, which, if I'm being honest, doesn't really make for too good content to cover, so I'm just going to be skipping that and instead getting into the 1v1 battle brackets, which is going to pretty much remain the same way as it was in the original, meaning first Shinso, then Todoroki, Ida, who's obviously going to opt out, with the final opponent being Bakugo. So let's get into how this would play out. I would like to think that the fight would start off with Dark being the one in control, due to the fact that Light was the one taking over both the obstacle race and the cavalry battle, and so with him stepping into the ring, I could see an easy scenario playing out in which, due to Dark's arrogance, he would actually end up speaking to Shinso, who would try to, aggravate him somehow, with Shinso smiling, thinking that that was over. But in that moment, Light would immediately take over, with Dark being pissed off that he was caught off guard with such a weak quirk. So with Light deciding that he wasn't going to give Shinso the chance to do the same to him, he would speed blitz Shinso, smashing a fist square into his stomach, as he would send Shinso catapulting out of the arena, hitting the grass, being completely knocked unconscious, with everybody cheering, being like, "Whoa, did you guys see that? The battle ended in 10 seconds, because realistically, this just would have been one of those battles that just ends so fast. And so with that finally being the case, we would see Izuku walking back to the waiting room alongside the rest of Class 1A, where in his Light persona, due to Dark, obviously not really liking to be around other people, we would see Light doing the brunt of the, talking to his classmates and, doing most of the interactions. This is when Todoroki would finally enter the room, and he would declare war against Deku, pretty much telling him that he's not going to be holding anything back against him, and that he's going to show him who's the better of the half and half quirk wielders, with a smiling Light commenting back that he hopes so, that it's going to be quite fun fighting another person with a half and half quirk. So as Todoroki would walk off, he would bump into Endeavor, who would tell him to give it his all against that boy, telling him that he better show him who's the better of the two, that as the number 2 hero, it's his responsibility to make him look good. So with Todoroki having been pissed off and low-key having it had his desire to not use his fire be enhanced, he would go into the battle thinking that the only thing he would be using is ice, and this version of Izuku wouldn't question what's going on with him, simply stepping into the ring with full confidence that Todoroki, if anyone, was the one that could give him a good fight. So as soon as everything would begin, Deku, knowing that Todoroki has lately begun starting his battles by shooting ice, he would almost immediately cut both of his hands together, as forming multiple little openings in his hand, he would shoot out a multitude of white light beams that would go straight to the direction of Todoroki. Think like if you've ever grabbed the hose and you kind of cup it weird so multiple little streams of water come out. Or for the guys, when you wake up in the morning and you go to take a leak and there's multiple streams coming out because you got your little hoodie. Alright, I think I low-key crossed the line, but point is, Deku sends multi-beams towards the direction of Todoroki, which all fly at him in multiple different angles, changing as they would make their way towards him, with a significant amount of them actually landing on Todoroki, who though would be able to actually dodge a few thanks to his ice, he wouldn't be able to predict all of them because they're just moving in strange patterns. And with that being said, we would zoom into a pissed off Todoroki who, realizing that he can't even shoot his ice faster than Deku can actually shoot his light attacks towards him, would suddenly raise his left side, or is it right side? I'm not sure, but the fire side basically towards Deku, about to blast it off towards him when Endeavor would interrupt his train of thought, going, "Yes, Shoto, use your real power," forcing Shoto to let his hand down as he would once again attempt to shoot an ice geyser at Deku. However, the same thing would happen once again, with Todoroki being beaten down slowly as Deku would ask him a question. Why not use his other half? With a pissed off Todoroki telling him it's none of his business, shooting a pillar of ice towards the direction of Light, who would smile before suddenly coating both of his fists in white bright light and starting to punch straight through that ice, with Todoroki shooting more and more towards him, similarly to what Bakugo would have done in the original timeline. And once Deku would finally get close distance with Todoroki, Deku's body would start shining so unbelievably bright light that Todoroki would be forced to cover his eyes, being greeted by a punch square to the stomach before suddenly Dark would take over and punch him square in the face, stunning Todoroki and leaving him completely immobile, grabbing him by the collar and telling him to go all out, that he isn't here to waste his time or the audience either. And with Todoroki looking at him with a pissed off expression, Dark would simply smirk in his face, telling him, "What? Daddy didn't teach you how to use your fire?" With a pissed off Todoroki engulfing with flames, telling him to just remember that he asked for it, shooting a blaze of flames towards the direction of Dark, who with the smirk would hold out one hand with a black orb of energy out in front of him, which would actually absorb the entirety of the flames, stunning Todoroki and the audience, present Mike going, "This is incredible! It appears Izuku Midoriya has found a way to litigate some attacks. How or when he did this, we don't know, but this is unpredictable." Going on to ask who they believe is gonna win, with the crowd being like, "You can do it, Deku!" And some people being like, "Go for it, Shoto!" This is when Todoroki, charging up both fire and ice, would look towards him once more, asking him to deflect this, as a smiling Dark would tell him that he's not planning on it, before suddenly taking energy from every single dark crevice in that arena and the nearby energy and channeling all of the little light particles that he possibly can and reversing them, kind of like a curse technique, to create a gigantic ball of like destruction. Think Frieza's massive attack that wipes planets, holding it out in front of Todoroki, as Todoroki's fire and ice attack would fly towards him and it would just be deleted by Deku's attack, who 1 inch away from Todoroki would suddenly disperse, sending a massive pool of black energy which would almost immediately kill like the air around them and the mood and send Todoroki crashing out of the arena, all of his negative emotions having actually been absorbed by that ball, as most of those negative emotions would be swirling around the crowd, with them not really knowing why they're feeling anger and sadness and regret, but they are. It's just a weird feeling that they would get. And with the sky finally clearing up and light coming back and pretty much like shining his like bright light, he would get rid of those effects, leaving everybody in the crowd to finally cheer and say that that was an incredible battle. The match is then moving on, as we would have Deku and Iida's match being announced, which would shortly after be cancelled due to Iida's, of course, exiting of the sports festival due to his older brother Manuel being targeted by Stain. And with that being the case, we are now free to jump into the final match, which would pretty much just be Deku versus Bakugo. And due to the fact that the last time that they fought, Dark was the one who took this one, Dark would feel more than comfortable letting Light take this one on. So the match would immediately begin by Light telling Bakugo to show him just how far he's come. Bakugo immediately starting the battle by blasting towards the direction of Light and creating a smoke screen where Light wouldn't be able to see anything. So Light, thinking quick on his feet, would return the favor to Bakugo, letting a bunch of light particle energy blast off from him, which would quite literally blind the audience itself. It's like he hit a solar flare point blank in Bakugo's face, which would successfully work. And with that being the case, Deku would immediately blitz towards the direction of Bakugo, slamming a light elbow into his stomach, causing Bakugo to immediately puke, as Deku would leap into the air and land a spinning back kick on the back of Bakugo's head, slamming this man onto the concrete and caving his face shape into the ground, resulting in Deku finally lifting his arm up and declaring himself the strongest in all of UA. Which would be strange because that's not a declaration he would normally make. That's more of a Dark thing, but for some reason to Light, it just felt right. And as he would raise his hand and everybody would be shocked, and obviously All Might comes down and gives him the medal like point blank, we would end up watching as Deku would celebrate the ceremony and like have like a little clip of him like biting the medal, thanking everybody and pretty much asking them if they would support his hero career in the future and to expect much more of him, which results in the audience being like, "We love you, Deku!" And Deku being like, "And I love you, random citizen." I don't know if you guys got that reference, but then after the sports festival would finally come to a close, we would zoom in on the image of All for One, who, having watched that battle live to assess the skills of this young man, he would be stunned, but more than anything, he would be desperate. And by that I mean desperate to get his hands on Deku's quirk, because in All for One's eyes, this power is on that of the level of One for All and even Star and Stripes' New Order. This quirk must be his. He would think as he would take a sip of wine and order Dr. Ujiko to find out anything he can about the boy and discover any potential weaknesses he can poke at. And with that beginning to pretty much have a start to the story, we end up jump cutting to the events of the students once they would return to UA, which is where they would be informed of two things. Number one, their ability to now choose their pro hero names, which they need to heavily think about considering this will follow them all of their lives. And number two, who they're going to be interning with, which also is a very big choice considering the intern is going to be determining what kind of hero they end up shaping out to be. So as Deku would stare at the long list of heroes who would have given him offers, this is when suddenly All Might would enter the classroom asking if he can speak to Izuku privately. So both of them making their way towards another room, this is when All Might would lay on him a request, telling him that he would love it if he was to go train under his mentor, who actually taught him how to become the #1 hero, saying that he sees so much incredible potential in the young man and that he would love it if he would give his mentor the opportunity of trying to shape him. Explaining that he sees a lot of himself in young Midoriya, as Izuku would accept immediately, saying that it's an honor for All Might to suggest to have him train under him or anyone that he knows, because anyone that All Might knows must be an incredible person. So, as Izuku would accept the offer and ask why he would have chosen him specifically, All Might would go on to tell him that the next generation doesn't need one incredible hero, it needs as many as it can. And so, smiling and giving him the address of Gran Torino, All Might would exit, leaving Izuku with a question. Just what will this man be like? Which he would find out soon, due to us having a little bit of a time skip to which Deku would be riding on the bus, doing a little bit of a background check on Gran Torino, seeing as Light is more of a meticulous type of character, and so as he's looking up the feats of the old retired Gran Torino hero, he would be expecting a tall dude with like the Gran Torino iconic costume, but when he would enter the room, he would spot a wrinkly old man. I mean, obviously he expected him to be old, but how the heck did he shrink, he would think, as he would walk over towards him and see Ketchup, and Light being as gullible as he is, he'd be like, "Is he dead?" As suddenly the voice of Dark would ring in his head. "He's not dead, you idiot, that's freaking Ketchup, smell it!" With Light being, "Oh, good," as Gran Torino would immediately start zipping around the room and try to land a kick on Deku, who would instantly block the blow, parrying it, having tracked Gran Torino's movements as though they were in slow motion, because the older Deku's been getting, the more in tune he's been getting with his quirk, and due to the fact that the quirk factors are finally starting to mix and merge, Deku's getting stronger literally day by day, all the while his connection to Dark would be growing stronger and stronger as well. And with Gran Torino finally landing and smirking, saying, "Huh, you're as good as Toshinori said, and even stronger than I expected from the videos," Deku would finally ask why he attacked them, Gran Torino explaining that he did that just as a bit of a test, saying that the real training starts now, as he would tell him to follow him, knowing that he doesn't need to train him up, he needs to show him how to patrol, he needs to show him what to look out for, and most importantly, he needs to shape the heart of the young man. So as the two would walk out, the harsh training would begin. As I would now finally have the chance to explain why Deku's with Gran Torino, which ultimately boils to one thing. At first, I thought it wouldn't make sense considering Mirio should probably go there, but after realizing that Mirio has Sir Night-Eye and he would likely end up going there for his internship, I figured that All Might, having seen Deku's growth and seeing what an incredible potential he has, thanks to not only the USJ, but now the UA Sports Festival, and seeing just what an incredible hero he's blossoming into, All Might would have that idea of, hey, the next generation doesn't deserve a symbol of peace, but symbols of peace, thinking like more along the lines of like the Justice League, having a lot more hope in this next generation, as he would end up pretty much requesting Gran Torino to train the boy, in effort of him, and Gran Torino, having seen his performance during the sports festival, it's just like, all right, bet, like I'll train this kid, you know what I mean? It doesn't really take much asking of All Might. And with that being said, it also leads us to, having me cover an arc that actually matters, and having Deku still have that fight with Stain, all the while having that connection with Gran Torino and learning how to not control his quirk, but how to, kind of develop a new way of looking at his abilities, I guess you could say is the word I'm looking for. But yeah, with that being said, let's get back into the story. Over the course of the training with Gran Torino, I'd like to think that Deku learned more specifically how to fight against more dastardly villains. I know that's kind of like a little bit of a joke word, but like literally, because Gran Torino mentored All Might, he would know the type of villains that are truly out there and the kind of stuff Izuku might have to very well run into. So teaching Deku to use more, hands-on, way more destructive techniques, he would end up telling Deku that though he'll definitely never have to use them against most villains, he should have that stuff in his arsenal. Dark's voice in the back basically being like, "Don't tell me, tell Light." With Light kind of just being like, yeah, like maybe I have been, taking it too easy on my opponents, or maybe I haven't really reached the limit of my potential because I kind of subconsciously hold back, not wanting to hurt anybody. But he would also be thinking that he would be willing to if he absolutely had to, though he doesn't feel like he would want to. He's too nice. A voice would echo inside of his head, with Dark finally coming out, nodding, saying that he'll take care of that. With Gran Torino having, of course, learned of Deku's dual personality thing and having been, filled in on the details of all that stuff. This ultimately would result in Deku having a little bit of a mental change, with him also doing a little bit of a light sparring with Gran Torino, learning a couple of brand new moves, and Deku and Light and Dark kind of going through this little thing where they each end up doing a whole lot more self-reflection on things and what they're going to be expected to do in the future, with them also learning a lot more about Hero Patrol, villains, and all that other stuff, eventually culminating in the day where they would make their way to Hosu in search of the hero killer himself, which ultimately would lead us to the situation in the anime in which a flying Nomu would end up pretty much bashing into the train that each of them would be on, with Gran Torino and Deku almost immediately lunging into action, Izuku recognizing the Nomu from the USJ and almost immediately leaping into action as Dark, blinding the Nomu almost instantaneously, taking advantage of the fact that nightfall has already come and dulling its senses by making the air and the aura around him so much damn darker that it's kind of like a genjutsu he placed him under, that ultimately makes him not see anything. Think the Bringer of Darkness technique from Naruto, or just imagine he blindfolded the Nomu with a bunch of darkness. I mean, best way I can put it. Anyways, though, with that being said, almost immediately following that, charging up 2 black orbs in his hand, Deku would send those flying towards the direction of the Nomu, as he would eviscerate it in its entirety, Gran Torino having kicked the Nomu straight into the blast of Deku, with each of them deciding that they need to back everyone up immediately. So as Gran Torino would lead the charge and Deku would follow behind him as Dark, we would suddenly see Dark's face expression changing, having noticed that Ida was nearby, something that only he could have done in that moment. And as he would do so, he would tell Gran Torino to hold the Nomus out for a second. He'll be back. His classmates in danger. And with Gran Torino trusting Deku's judgment and combat capabilities, he would go off in search of the Nomus, all the while Deku would have the shadowy aura going off of him as his speed would increase, matching if not surpassing the speed of Light himself, who would low-key get a little salty at this, watching as Deku would appear immediately in front of Stain as the villain's vision would darken, and recognizing that someone is here, Stain would say to state their purpose, drawing his blade as finally on high guard and using all of his senses to try to track Deku down. He would sense a fist flying in his direction, but he wouldn't be able to do a thing about it, as the fist would smash into Stain's body, sending him backwards before tendrils would grab onto Stain and pull him back, as Izuku would ask him what exactly he thought he was doing with his classmate, all the while flaring an aura of utter chaos and just despair, with Stain being fully unconscious, as Deku would realize he might have went a bit too far there. This is when suddenly Light, taking back, would end up going towards Ida, asking if he's okay. Ida telling him that that was his fight, pissed off at Deku, who simply smiling at the direction of Deku would tell him that he probably just isn't aware of what's going on for him, but telling him that he'll be safe now and they can talk about things later. Picking up the bodies of not only Ida, but Native, and taking them directly to the entry of help. This is when Deku lunging into action alongside the heroes Gran Torino and Endeavor, and even Todoroki because he wouldn't message him in this timeline. Deku would go on to land a finishing blow on one of the Nomus, as the rest of the heroes would recognize that another student has arrived, and it just so happens to be another half and half user. So as the entire interaction would finally end, we would see Deku turning to Todoroki, saying something like, "Dude, that was crazy. Did you expect to," as Todoroki would just kind of walk away, not really liking Deku thanks to that previous encounter, and really having no reason to talk to him. So as Deku would realize that Todoroki isn't really messing with him due to what Dark had done during the sports festival, he would tell him that that wasn't cool. Dark saying that they don't need weak friends, as Izuku would roll his eyes, and we would suddenly see Gran Torino appearing next to him going, "Well kid, it appears I've taught you everything I can. I think it's safe to say Toshinori will be really happy when he finds out just how much stronger you've grown. Not just physically, but mentally, kid." As Dark would take over and smile, saying, "Thanks, old man." This is when finally boarding onto the train and making its way home the next day, after a good night's rest, Deku would finally arrive home, eating some nice deserved home-cooked meal from his mother, as he'd be like, "This is the best. There's nothing like a warm-cooked meal with you, Mom, after a long days of training." With Ingo saying, well, get your fill and make sure Light gets a chance to eat some too. As Light would finally snap in, being like, hell, will do, Mom. As she would suddenly hear the voice echoing of Light and Dark, because mind you, Light talks a little higher pitched and Dark talks a little bit slower. And she hears both of them as she turns around and is like, Izuku? With two voices once again echoing out, yes, Mom. This would stun all of them as Light and Dark would both realize what's happening, understanding that now the quirk must be growing even more than ever, leading Inko to be like, wait right there, as she grabs the phone and just immediately starts speed dialing the doctor, who would answer the phone on like the third ring and be like, yes, is there something going on with Izuku? As she's like, both of them are speaking. He's like, Light and Dark, and she's like, yes, they're both speaking at the same time. He's like, I'll be right there. As what, give 10 minutes later, the doctor's there, sweating and everything, because bro had just like practically ran there. Well, not literally, but you know, he ran to his car, then he had to park far because there was no parking lots and he had to run there. So, but point is, he gets there and he's like dead tired, right? He's like, all right, what's going on? Immediately using his eye to, you know, use his quirk to sense what their abilities are doing. And he would be like, this is incredible. It happened even sooner than I predicted. I expected this change might happen when Izuku was turning to a young man at 18, 20, but to have it happen now, it's unbelievable. With us seeing exactly what he's seeing, the reading would say quirk, half light, half dark. Although while its description would be glitched out, with us watching as Izuku's left side would be glowing this like golden light type sun-like energy, all the while his other side would be emanating darkness, leading both voices to say, finally. This is when each power would be capable of being wielded in both hands, as the room would start being sapped of its light energy. However, Light side would be filling it back up, so you can't even tell the difference. And as both of them would be staring at their hands, kind of realizing simultaneously that they're now going to be able to do combination attacks. Not the way they did them in the sports festival, but real combination attacks where they can actually shoot light and dark simultaneously, maybe even combining the two to create a new element, they would think. So as these thoughts would flood their minds, this is when suddenly we would see Light and Dark's energy start to beam off of them, as one light at the house would end up getting so dark that it would almost look as though someone had literally turned off the lights and just closed off all the blinds, although on one side of the house you can barely see anything, with the two disappearing almost as soon as it happened, as Inko and the doctor would be sitting there going, huh? Where did they? As Inko would be like, get back here, you two! Kind of covering her mouth for a second, be like, I mean, Izuku, but she'd be like, I don't even know what to call them. Dr. Luttrell looking at her and smiling, saying that those two are gonna be an incredible hero. Or that one, he would say, before smiling and looking at Inko, saying that he understands what she means. It's a bit confusing. This is when both she and the doctor would end up smiling amongst each other, as after this would take place, we would jump cut to seeing Deku on Dagoma Beach, where he starts spamming random attacks. Like, he's literally just trying stuff at this point, with both of them having the time of their lives. This is when suddenly stopping the cool little combination attacks, the light dark dragon kick that they would have ended up coming up with, they would end up landing, as Light would end up saying, you know, I feel like there's more strength we can access, with Dark kind of like sadly being like, I know, but we don't need it. We'll be good like this, right? Light telling him that, yeah, that they'll be fine like this. I mean, after all, who's gonna really fight them at this point, right? With Dark replying that there's no reason they'll ever encounter someone strong enough to push them beyond this. Light smiling, saying that, yeah, after all, if that does happen, we can always just use that last measure. Dark smiling as each of them would decide to hold back their true power, the real combination. And so, with both of them continuing to practice these little moves while that like training My Hero Academia music would be playing in the background, the next day would finally come around where, once entering the classroom, everybody almost instantly picks up on the fact that Deku just feels different, as they would end up talking to him and they would hear back the echo of two voices responding almost simultaneously, which they've never heard before. So they would ask, are you okay? To which he would say, never ever better, with them being like, but it sounds like Dark and Light are talking. With Deku responding, yeah, we finally somewhat fused together, with Bakugo's voice echoing in the background. Damn time, Deku. I assume this means you're not going to be having a little bipolar disorder anymore, will ya? We might not, Izuku would say, leading Bakugo to just stare at him awkwardly as he would say, "You're a total freak show, Deku," walking off. This is when Aizawa would finally enter the classroom, as he would begin explaining that today their hero course activity is simple. They're going to be doing a bit of an obstacle course just to see how much they've truly grown. As the class would get excited and go, "All right, and we're safe to assume no one's getting expelled today, right, Aizawa?" As he would say, "You're right about that, but someone just might, depending on if you guys manage to fail your final exams." As the class would get worried and be like, "Totally not fair, but I guess it makes sense." This is when the entirety of the class would start talking about how they're gonna do their own studying, and people who are failing the class would be like, "I have no chance, I'm ranked 14 in the class," like they start freaking out, which ultimately leads to a study group being formed at Momo's house, much like it does in the original, all the while the rest of the class would pretty much end up making their way towards the outside section, where they would begin to have the rules explained for this little section, being told that it's going to be a 4v4 battle in which the students are going to be split up amongst groups, trying to see which one can actually find All Might first, and whoever does that obviously will be declared the winner. So this is when we would see the lineup of Sento, Tape Boy, Ojiro, the guy with the tail, Tenya Ida, Mina Ashida, oh wait, that's 5, and Izuku, yeah, my bad, I guess it was 5, but yeah, no, they would all pretty much get to the finish line, and as soon as All Might would blow the starter's pistol, they would all be off. Tape Boy using his tape to start flying around like Spider-Man, Mina using her acid to start sliding across the pipes, and Ojiro using his tail to whip himself around, with Ida obviously using his engine quirk to zip around on his legs, which finally leads us to Izuku, who would simply watch his classmates go forth as he would close his eyes and look at his hand, pretty much trying to psych himself up, I guess you could say, and ask himself if he's ready to show them just how much he's grown, leading to Izuku lighting up on one half and the other half just having this dark Blackbeard-like energy shooting off of him, leading him to zip off as his speed would be unmatched by any of them. All the while Izuku would look like a half lit up moon because one side is on light and the other side you can barely see it, but Izuku would make quick work of this exercise, appearing in front of All Might as the hero would smile, going, "Izuku Midoriya is the winner!" leading everybody to be like, "Did he just use both of his powers?" With the entirety of the class starting to hype him up, being like, "Dude, you've grown so much." All the while Deku would be smiling, smirking, and he would finally be like, "Thanks guys, yeah, it's been a long process, but we're both pretty happy that we've grown this far." With Dark's voice echoing out saying, "Yeah, I guess you could say I'm a bit happy." With the class being like, "Would you look at that, even Dark's a little happy." Dark kind of blushing, as one half of him starts blushing and the other half's just laughing. It's kind of like a weird face expression that Deku would be doing in this moment. But as soon as class would be over, All Might would end up asking Izuku if he would have time to have a little chat. With Izuku smiling and being like, "Oh, for you, All Might?" Of course, two voices would ring out, leading to a smiling All Might to take them towards his office, where he would go on to say that he's incredibly impressed with their improvement, explaining that since he sent him with Gran Torino, his master's been in incredible spirits and is optimistic about the future of heroes as a whole, going on to thank Izuku as he would stop him, saying that honestly, it was so beneficial. Getting a new perspective and somebody who's been around for way longer to teach them these things was honestly such an honor. So they would say, "We should thank you." As bowing down their head, they would end up pretty much then turning towards All Might, who now with smiling back at them would end up saying that because of that, he thinks it's about time he introduced them to a little somebody, as Mirio would finally end up phasing through the ground and be like, "What's up?" Wait, did he just phase through the wall? Izuku would say, as All Might would laugh, going on to say that he's proud to introduce him to Togata Mirio, one of Yue's brightest students and his formal successor. Stunning Izuku, who would then go on to ask, is he gonna put on any clothes? With Mirio sitting there extending a hand as he would say, "Oh right, sorry about that. Guess I must have gotten caught up on the entrance and not so much on the first impression." Giving the dude 3 seconds to finally put some clothes on as he would again extend his hand out, with Izuku shaking it saying, "So what's this guy's deal, All Might?" As All Might would smile and then go on to explain the whole stuff about all for one, one for all, and how Mirio ended up coming into the equation, explaining how he had transferred his quirk to him and how Mirio has been working to attain 100% of its power. Izuku being like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." Going on to then ask, "Wait, so if you already had a successor, then why send me with Mr. Torino?" With All Might saying, "Oh, right, that. Well, you see, young Izuku, I had actually wanted Mirio to go there, but he ended up declining in effort of going with Sir Night-Eye. Izuku being like, wait, so Sir Night-Eye is the one training him? I guess that makes sense, seeing as he was your sidekick, so he would understand how to train him. With Mirio being like, that's right, and he has been doing an incredible job, might I add. With Deku looking towards Mirio and asking, so just how strong are ya? Mirio looking at him with a smile and going, care to find out? With them both staring at All Might, who would be like, don't look at me, I never said you two could fight, which leads both of them to be like, just a quick spar, with Izuku being like, yeah, what's the worst that could happen? Which would lead All Might to being like, I guess, as he would go on to ask Principal Nezu if they can spar after school would be over, and with Principal Nezu thinking that that's a pretty cool idea, he would agree, saying that he wants to watch though, as both students would then be sent to their own, classes to finish off the day, as after this would happen, about 4 hours later, both students would end up meeting in the gym, where Zuko and Mirio would both be seen doing a bit of light stretching, before Nezu would go on to explain the rules, telling them that this is going to be a 20-second spar, seeing as they don't exactly want to have to rebuild this entire facility. So with Deku smiling and Mirio doing the same, this is when we would watch Mirio phase into the ground, using the speed of One For All to plop out fast as ever, leaving a shocked Deku to narrowly be able to dodge the attack from Mirio thanks to two things. One, his incredible speed, and two, the fact that he threw off Mirio's senses due to the light and darkness that were hitting him at the same time, and Mirio wasn't used to fighting under these conditions. So, with the strike missing, we would get a clip of Deku trying to land a light punch on Mirio, which would phase right through him, as Deku would think, figures. This is when suddenly Mirio's fist would come flying towards his direction, and as it would connect, it would send Deku flying backwards, crashing into the wall, leading a ball of white and black energy to shoot off from Deku, as all of the rubble that he would have created would shoot up off of him, and almost immediately Deku would be in a new state. Perfect merge is what Deku calls this one, as we would watch Deku's speed pick up at least 3 times what he was moving at before, stunning Mirio, who would watch on as not only beams of light would start chasing him like homing missiles, but balls of darkness would start flowing around Mirio, leaving the boy in a constant state of phasing, with Deku eventually getting up close and personal and beginning to charge a theoretical attack that Izuku's had in his mind, combining both light and dark to create a ball that would start sucking up all matter around it, similarly to a black hole, but way worse. This starts to actually change the structure of the building, all the while pulling All Might and Nezu towards it, with All Might narrowly managing to keep them from flying into it thanks to the fact that he has One For All, and Mirio, who would be closest to this black hole ball of energy, would actually start getting sucked into it, feeling his intangibility start to disappear slowly. So with Mirio letting out a cry of pain, Izuku would almost instantaneously undo the ball of energy in front of him, stunning everybody watching, with Principal Nezu plopping down from the arms of All Might and being like, well Izuku, it would appear you truly are as talented as I believed. You managed to find a workaround around Mirio. Unfortunately though, it would seem you might need a bit more work on that move, as Mirio, getting up, feeling himself wheezy, would end up telling Izuku that he felt strange when he used that ability, asking him what that was. Izuku going on to explain that he's not sure, it's an experimental move, and with Mirio going on to tell him that the closer he got to that ball, the more he felt like his quirk factor was just disappearing, stunning Izuku, who would say, wait, are you serious? As Mirio would say, serious as a heart attack, dude. I nearly thought I lost my powers there. Deku turning towards him and apologizing for that profusely, as Principal Nezu would once again get the attention of everybody and say, well, let's just clean this up and call it a day. I must say though, Izuku, you should practice restraint when trying out new moves, especially against classmates. As Izuku would bow, apologizing once again and leaving the area, which leads us as the audience to look into Izuku's thoughts, him basically talking amongst himself, as he would end up thinking of ways to utilize that ability, saying that though it might be dangerous and they probably shouldn't use it against friends or allies, it might be useful against villains. Light saying that it might be taking things a bit too far. What happens if they get so close that attack just straight up tears them into pieces? With Dark saying that if they die, well, they die. They chose to be villains. Nobody made them that way. As Light would say, what are you talking about? We don't kill people. As Dark would remind him about the Nomu. What about that? Izuku telling him that that's different. The Nomu's not a human. The Nomu's, it's alive, Light. The Nomus are alive, and we killed them. What difference does it make whether it's a human or a Nomu? We killed something. And it's not like we did it in order to save our behind. We did it to save people, to stop casualties, and to stop burning buildings from being set ablaze. Light kind of just being awkwarded out by the situation, as he would say that they can just talk about this another day, with Dark saying that they could talk about it, but at the end of the day, one day they're gonna have to make a tough call with the real villain, with Light saying, I know. As we would pretty much time skip to the future, where the students would all finally be taking the final exams. Deku passing the written exam as easy as ever, seeing as, he kind of has two consciousnesses to study for him at any given time, as we would then finally move on to the 1v2 battles, where Izuku in this timeline would end up being paired up alongside Todoroki, due to the fact that obviously there's some clear disdain there, and they don't believe that Todoroki will work well against Izuku. Plus, both students paired up against All Might just kind of makes sense. So after all other battles would finally be taken care of, we would watch on as Izuku and Todoroki would be the last left in the waiting room. Izuku asking Todoroki what kind of strategy they should employ against the symbol, with Todoroki telling him in an ice cold tone that he works better alone, with a voice echoing out that would clearly be Dark saying, now don't go punishing Light for something that I did. I humiliated you during the sports festival, not Light. So if you're gonna be rude and be a complete jerk to someone, do it to me. Todoroki walking off as he would say, I already am Split, echoing the same name that Bakugo will call Deku when he's trying to tease him, with the room going extremely quiet and dark, all the while two tendrils would wrap around Todoroki's leg as he would tell him to look at him. Todoroki preparing to fight before suddenly Light would take over once again and Light would fill the room, apologizing for what Dark did, with both minds finally being left in the room at once as they begin to argue amongst themselves. Dark saying that he's way too easygoing. He just let this guy humiliate both of them. It's not one person he's disrespecting, it's two, and he happens to be part of it. So he's gonna teach that guy a lesson one way or the, as Light would pretty much end up yelling out in his subconsciousness. Stop it already. We don't need to fight amongst our classmates. The reason he's pissed off is because of us, and we have no right to reprimand him or tell him how to act towards us. We're just gonna have to let time do its thing. Leaving the hero to kind of stand there as finally making his way outside, we would see Izuku and Todoroki matched up against All Might, who appears before them almost instantly, leaving Todoroki to shoot a pillar of ice towards the direction of the symbol, who would counter by shooting off a wind force punch at its direction, shattering the ice, which would leave a scowling Todoroki to watch on as Izuku would use two tendrils of Light and Dark to whip onto the arms of All Might, pulling him towards him, as a symbol of peace would counter this by allowing his momentum to fly towards him, reeling his fists back in an attempt to absolutely clobber Deku, who, seeing this telegraphed attack coming towards him, he would end up lunging towards the direction of All Might, all the while both of them would be coming at each other extremely fast, and both of his legs would light up. Well, not literally, one half would light up, the other half would darken, before plunging his knees directly into the stomach of All Might, sending the hero flying into the air as light beams would be chasing All Might, who would be hit by them, causing little light explosions to go off, all the while Todoroki, jealous of the fact that Izuku's handling All Might like an absolute pro, would end up rushing in, blasting a beam of flames towards the direction of All Might, who, now falling towards the ground, would end up blowing the flames back with nothing but his wind, like his you know how Superman does the Now, I know obviously All Might doesn't inherently have this ability, but come on, bro. This just makes for a tough scene. So All Might blowing back the firepower of Todoroki would leave Todoroki wide-eyed as Izuku appearing right in front of him, holding his hand out as he would absorb the light of the flames with its darkness. He would end up asking Todoroki if he's okay, pissing him off even more as he would tell him that he didn't need the help, leading to an argument to burst out between Dark and Todoroki, with All Might taking the opportunity to lunge towards them, grabbing each of them by the heads before trying to slam them down. However, to All Might's surprise, both hands would immediately recoil in pain, seeing as Izuku and Todoroki would both use each of their sides to end up pretty much causing major damage to the hand of All Might, forcing him to let go and start blowing at them, as suddenly an attack of ice would be sent towards him, all the while an attack of dark energy would hit All Might point blank, sending the symbol of peace flying through 8 buildings, with Dark saying, "Guess you're not that bad, Icy Hot," as his body would engulf in a light-like energy and he would rush to the body of All Might, checking to see if he's finally out for the count, only to find that All Might was now rising to his feet, as Izuku would prepare a light cannon in one arm and a massive ball of dark energy in the other, telling All Might to concede, with All Might smiling as he would say he gives up. This is when Izuku would place the capture tape around All Might as he would go on to celebrate his victory, telling thanks to Todoroki before walking off, not really making another attempt at trying to befriend him, seeing as clearly time will take care of that. And so with the final exams arc finally being over, we can now get into the Two Heroes arc, which I thought would be a cool little inclusion for this series of the story, just due to the fact that Mirio would actually be present along with the students, and there's a really cool idea that I had for this arc to play out, which isn't really going to be too long considering that, mind you, this is a movie arc, so I'm kind of going to rush past this one just a little bit. That said, for this whole thing to work, we have to have All Might not only invite Mirio along for the trip, but also Izuku. So we see Mirio and Deku talking amongst themselves on the plane, with Mirio going on to tell him what it was like going to UA, what it was like learning how to use his own quirk, and how strange it was to find that his quirk control actually got better when he was given One for All, explaining that not only did it improve his control, but it even gave him incredible strength, where now Mirio can practically one-shot most villains, and it's kind of become a little boring, he would say, admittedly, with Deku saying, yeah, having too much power can sometimes feel like that, as the plane would finally land, and we would see all three of them stepping out in their pro hero costumes, with Mirio being like, oh right, I never asked you, what is your hero name? As Deku would turn towards Mirio and say that his hero name was Moon Knight, a name that I picked because originally I was gonna choose the name Split, but after thinking about it, I was like, nah. What is something that is both light and dark? And after finally saying the moon, which can be light or dark given on the specific moment, I was like, bro, that's tough, but I can't just call him Moon. Like, that just doesn't sound cool enough. And then I remembered the Marvel hero Moon Knight, and I was like, oh yeah, that's the one. So yeah, Moon Knight it is for this timeline. But anyways, with that being said, the heroes would end up getting off of the train, or not the train, but the plane, as we would then have Melissa Shield make her introduction to the story, and we would get a little sweet moment between All Might and Melissa, which ultimately leads to the introduction of Deku and Mirio, as the two would pretty much be introduced as his successors, strangely enough. Mirio shaking her hand and saying, wow, pleasure to meet you, as Izuku would be like, same, with Melissa smiling at each of them and going, wow, did I just hear you speak twice? Izuku looking towards her as he would explain that his quirk is a little strange, but she'll get used to it. She would say, yeah, I'm sure I will, as she would pretty much go on to say Uncle Might has to talk to David, and taking him over there, she would pretty much go on to, have the two talk a little bit, all the while she would take the time to not only introduce Deku to the island, but Mirio, who would serve as the life of the party, leading to Light, wanting to, get his 2 cents in, all the while Dark is like, nah, like, let's just hang back, you know what I mean? With Ultimate, being like, let me just take over. As, we pretty much have Mirio and Deku, just both giving Melissa, the funnest day of her life, because their personalities are just bouncing off each other so perfectly that they're just they basically look and act like comedians, you know what I mean? Like, they're using their quirks to make jokes funnier and stuff like that. Which ultimately leads to Melissa saying that she loves each of them, and that they're just so cool, that they must be amazing friends. To which they would point out that they actually just met, her being stunned that they have this much chemistry together even though they don't even know each other, as she would go on to say that they have to come to the party later, with Mirio explaining that he actually already was gonna go, saying he has his suit right here. Deku saying, yeah, his is in his hero costume as well, with Melissa being like, well, great, I can't wait to see you guys later, without that whole scene where Deku gets the, the armband from Melissa, considering he doesn't have One for All, and Mirio isn't exactly in a state where he would need something like that, so we don't have that little event playing out. Instead, we end up kind of just jump cutting to a scene where Mirio and Deku were getting ready for the party, and they would arrive. They're all talking amongst each other, Mirio's making a couple jokes here and there, and we would then see the introduction of Nejire and Tamaki, because Mirio obviously would have invited each of them, and seeing as All Might is a symbol of peace, he was able to pull a couple of strings. That said, as all of them would be preparing, to make their way to the ballroom where they're about to have the, the little stuff introductions and all that, this is when suddenly the security would go haywire, leading to Melissa being like, wait, what's going on? Shocked that the security system was acting out of whack. And so, with that being the case, Mirio and Deku both kind of just look at each other alongside Nejire and Tamaki, understanding that something must be going on. So Mirio, using his phase quirk to find out that there's actual villains on the island, he would end up letting everybody know, saying that they need to save them, and that they have hostages, and that they need to play this carefully. So Mirio, using his phasing ability, would start to, pretty much go and phase up as high as he can, thanks to Melissa telling them that they can shut down the security system and thus, neutralize the the hostages, when Izuku would suddenly stop him, telling him that he's not going in alone, using his quirk to completely obliterate the suit that he has on, as he would end up telling Mirio to lead the way, climbing from the outside, with Mirio making his way up every single room, all the while Deku, having Melissa on his back, would end up climbing the side of the building using his half light, half dark quirk. And once they would make it to the top, Melissa would say, "All right, perfect, there's nobody here," seeing as they would have made it there so fast that I don't think any villains other than some fodder would be there, meaning that they would get knocked out so fast by Mirio that they don't even have time to report to Wolfram what's going on. And with Melissa almost immediately taking down the defense system, this would allow All Might to leap into action, having a one-on-one fight against Wolfram, who, mind you, without having that technology that he had to upgrade his quirk, he would just completely shut bro down, meaning that the heroes would be so successful in this timeline and literally nobody gets hurt whatsoever. No one gets shot, no one gets stabbed, no one even has to fight against any quirked villains. Actually, low-key, with the exception of Kirishima and Bakugo, because they probably would still get lost and still end up facing off against those two dudes that they fought in that elevator area. But yeah, with that being said, this entire movie thing is completely prevented, and instead it's just a minor hitch in the road, where David would ultimately end up confessing to All Might that that was his plan and he was a fool for, thinking about things the way that he was, telling him that after seeing his two, successors in action and that they were clearly able to stop this plan, he's pretty much safe when it comes to the future. Like he thinks that they're in good care. I guess, am I explaining that right? I'm not sure. But what I'm ultimately trying to say is that David would end up pretty much giving them their blessing and honestly confessing to Melissa everything that happened, her being saddened but sort of understanding where her father was coming from, leaving Mirio and Deku with two gifts, two inventions that he thinks might be capable of helping them in the long run, which I'm gonna be revealing later on. That is, if I even remember. Maybe instead of inventions, he gives them these cool hero suits or something like that, or he could give Deku a custom hero suit and then give Mirio like a Mark II version of his pro hero suit, like a black one. Bro, that'd be so tough. But yeah, no, that's what pretty much ends up taking place in regards of the Island incident, meaning that we're now able to get back into the story at the point where we would have the Force training camp arc, leading us to a little bit of a time skip moment in which all of the students would be looking out the window, kind of just talking about how pretty the view is, until suddenly the bus would stop at a weird little viewpoint area, where Kaminari would be like, "This is so sweet, but wait, what are we doing here if the camp is..." As everybody almost immediately recognizes what's about to go down, and almost immediately, the entirety of Class 1A gets thrown over the cliff, as the students would be tasked with facing off against Pixie Bob's minions, which they would all of course do so, arriving back at camp in pretty good fashion considering that Deku would just absolutely obliterate the minions, making it so that their time would practically be cut in half. Because mind you, this version of Deku was easily clapping the one that had One for All at this point in the story. And so, with that being the case, we end up having a couple of days go by in which everybody would have their original training montages, with me kind of being like I just need to be transparent with you guys. I don't really know what kind of actual training Deku could do in terms of what the staff would make him do. So I'm gonna have Deku start working on ultra moves and finishing moves, specifically the one that he would have used against Mirio a few short minutes ago. And with that being the case, we would see Deku working on this very dangerous attack in the middle of the woods as trees start literally bending inwards towards the direction of where Deku's training, leaving that a permanent thing. Multiple trees are bending inwards towards this specific direction, making that little landscape look kind of crazy, and it'd be kind of sick, but it would also look a little scary. It's kind of like Long Ring Longland. But I digress. Point being, with a couple of days of training passing and the class, getting stronger and stronger little by day, Deku would eventually end up developing a new skill over this time, one in which he can create weapons out of darkness and light. Specifically offensive things and defensives. For instance, Deku is capable of creating a light shield or a darkness shield, which ends up kind of absorbing whatever goes into it, and it straight up disappears. I'm not sure where, but it just goes. It's gone. He's also capable of creating this gigantic claw on his left arm, which would be covered in darkness, which is just it's just a devastating attack. And he would be capable of developing a darkness chain, which literally is kind of like Ghost Rider's chain. It's pretty freaking sick, alongside light swords, light hammers, light shields, and you get the picture. It's just a bunch of light weapons when it comes to that, little light constructs that he's able to create. Oh, he also even came up with a sick idea called the light cage, where you can't break out of it because if you touch the light cage, it's kind of like a high voltage fence, which is pretty sick in terms of a capture weapon. But I digress. With that being the case, and the couple of days of training finally being under everybody's belt, the moment where the Vanguard Action Squad would attack would finally come, and as the students would be playing, I think it was hide and seek, or like some random game that they were playing in the forest, they would suddenly be encountered by the villains, with Deku noting Koda's presence to be gone. As questioning Mandalay on where he went, she would say that she doesn't know, but that he has a tendency of running off, as Deku, using his darkness quirk that can essentially allow him to like sense his surroundings so long as it's dark and there's shadows in the area, Deku would end up spotting Koda alongside another massive figure approaching him. And with Deku making this connection almost immediately, we would see the body of Deku immediately light up as he flies towards the or not flies literally, but like he like rushes over there as fast as humanly possible, leaving a crater in the section where he was standing, as the heroes and students would be like, "Where are you?" But Deku would be gone, because the moment that he would arrive, Deku would barely manage to save the life of Koda, leaving him to dodge Muscular's gigantic fist, which would have come flying at him. As Deku would then go on to create a darkness shield in front of him, with Muscular attempting to punch it and feeling that his arm was being torn to shreds while he was touching the darkness, all the while he felt like it was tugging at him, like sucking him in. So Muscular, reinforcing his muscles, would end up pulling his arms, going, "Hey kid, that attack actually tickled a little bit. What do you say we go at it, huh?" Rushing to the direction of Deku, who at this point, pissed off at the fact that this villain was genuinely about to try to kill someone, would look up with a shadowy mist echoing from his face, Muscular being stunned as he would think, just like Kurogiri, as suddenly from the shadow that was actually formed underneath Muscular, a hand would extend, grabbing Muscular by the back of his shirt in an attempt to drag him down. All the while Muscular would actively fight against this, going, "Huh? What is this?" Giving Deku the perfect opportunity to tell him, "Judgment," as he would end up firing a gigantic light cannon blast at the direction of Muscular, sending him flying into that darkness void, with Muscular being just torn to shreds inside of it, as releasing him much similar to what Blackbeard does in One Piece. Muscular would be completely unconscious with a horrified expression on his face. And in case you guys have seen Invincible, think what Blackwing or Nightwing or whatever the heck that guy's name is, he sent him to like a different dimension where there's nothing but darkness in there. So it's like, it's kind of horrifying, I'm not gonna lie. But with that attack finally being over, and Light even being pissed enough to like not even say anything about it, they end up deciding that they need to go help their classmates, specifically Tokiyami, who in this moment was losing himself to the power of darkness, sensing it from even as far as he was, as Izuku would lunge towards his direction, immediately appearing in front of Tokiyami and blasting a ray of light straight to the direction of him, with Dark Shadow immediately going back into Tokiyami and regaining control. But in almost a flash, Deku would be gone, making his way to help his classmate Momo as well as that Ayase guy, as Deku would smile, saying he's been dying to try this move, placing two hands together as forming a ball of light and dark energy, he would send it flying to the direction of the Nomu, discovering over these few days of training that if this attack is thrown, it inherently works as a destroyer of the target, annihilating every single little bit and piece of the Nomu, as the ball itself would dissipate on Deku's command, immediately like just leaving gone, with the trees having been bent slightly thanks to even that split second attack that was launched. And with Momo and Ayase now being on the ground, Deku would turn to, or Awase being on the ground, Deku would ask if they're okay. Them both nodding, with Deku just almost immediately, like once again, this flash of light and dark energy that's flying off of him would just disappear, showing up in front of Tetsu as Deku shooting a light gun pistol straight to the head of the dude with the gas quirk that was pretty much poisoning him. He would end up knocking that dude out immediately, with the gas almost instantly clearing up and dissipating, as Deku would be gone once again. Like the dude wasn't even there for a second. They only knew Deku was there thanks to the breeze of light that just immediately filled the area. And with Deku now finally having the chance to help out his two other classmates in Ochaku and Tsuyu, Deku would appear in front of them, Himiko Toga immediately leaping backwards, as sensing the power difference between herself and Izuku, she would attempt to turn tail and run, but Deku's not having it, because in his eyes, she's a villain. Which means that Deku would shoot 3 finger bullets to the direction of Toga, who falling unconscious on the ground, he would then ask Tsuyu and Uraraka to apprehend her, meaning that all of those villains would immediately have been captured, and Deku would now be left with 2 other groups that he has to help, in Todoroki and Bakugo, and Tiger and Mandalay. And so taking his choice and knowing that Todoroki probably wouldn't be too fond of him appearing and saving the day, he would end up choosing to help the heroes, appearing in front of Spinner and Magna, who would have had the upper hand in the fight that they were just a part of. But once Deku arrived, everything shifted, since we would see a beam of light appearing out of nowhere, showing up next to Spinner and just like disappearing, as Spinner would have been completely knocked unconscious, blinded for a split second, as Deku creating a light sword and slashing at the direction of Spinner, leaving him down for the count. He would then end up appearing next to Magna, who using his quirk to repel Deku and send him backwards, would only serve to piss off Izuku, who lifting his right hand up would cause a little portal underneath the leg of Magna to grab at him, and with Magma looking down going, "What? What is this?" This would give Deku just the perfect opportunity to throw a ball of darkness square the direction of Magna, knocking the dude out because of the negative energy that would be a part of it. And with all of the villains practically having been defeated, with the exception of course, Dabi and Twice, and Mr. Compress, can't forget Mr. Compress, we would then have Deku appear in front of all three of them, asking them what exactly they thought was going to happen here. With Dabi saying, looks like we've got a guest, shooting an array of flames to the direction of Deku, who's shooting out just a beam of darkness similarly to, like, just imagine like black flames flying at him. They would absorb the blue flames, making them into nothing, as Mr. Compress noting this would end up saying that that ability is interesting. Although while Twice would say, "He's beating you! Yeah, Dabi, go get him!" Following that by creating a couple of duplicates, as rushing to the direction of Deku, they would attempt to take him down, but suddenly, all of their visions would be completely covered in darkness, with Deku's voice being the only thing that could echo out, as they could swear that there was like a red hue in Deku's eyes, because that was the only thing they could see, in this mist of like a thing that they were just seeing right now. Like their eyes weren't working, but for some reason they saw a red light beaming in the darkness that just hunted them like they were his prey, as Deku would end up taking each of them out with brutal attacks, leaving all three of them knocked out, Deku having given in to the power of dark for a second, leaving every single one of the villains in the Vanguard Action Squad to completely be taken out, with the exception of course of Kurogiri, who seeing all of that would have ended up making his disappearance, reporting to All For One that he seems to have actively gotten stronger than what even they remember during the festival, shocking All For One, who then placing his head on his hand would end up saying that it's a shame, but they'll just have to break out the prisoners pretty soon, at least a few of them, which ultimately leads to a time skip without the Camino Ward incident due to the fact that nobody gets kidnapped, meaning the heroes don't have any leads, and ultimately, even if they were to have raided the bar, I just don't believe that All For One would let Shigaraki remain there, so that attack on the League of Villains hideout would be to no avail, and so, instead of having that arc play out, all the while the heroes would be distracted, All For One would end up posing a full-scale attack on Tartarus, breaking out a multitude of the villains that were captured, specifically Dabi, Toga, Twice, Mr. Compress, and Muscular, the ones that more so easily could be controlled. And with that being the case, this would mean that the heroes would pretty much be in the same situation they were before, with many things not being changed, meaning that we're able to simply get into the provisional hero licensing exam arc, which of course Deku having such incredible power, finesse, and techniques that he was taught to him thanks to Gran Torino, we would have him just absolutely embarrass everybody, or not literally embarrass them because he's not on that type of timing here, but just kind of leave everybody to wonder if they can even match up to that ever, because we're talking about a hero student who's already acting as though he was in the top 10, and in fact already seems as though he's even stronger than most of the top 10 heroes, stunning everybody who would watch Deku just annihilate people when it comes to knocking people out when it comes to the balls, doing the rescue operation, and even facing off against King Orca at full power, might I add, and just absolutely embarrassing the villain. Like, it's not okay. But yeah, with that being said, this means that arc would come and go pretty fast, and due to the fact that Deku and Kacchan just don't have the same relationship that they do in canon, and it's clear that Deku's the stronger of the two, there wouldn't be a Deku versus Kacchan fight, meaning that we're able to get directly into the events that lead to the Overhaul arc, which I won't lie, won't be much of an arc, what with Mirio and Deku pulling up on him canonically. So what do y'all say we do a little bit of a speed run for this arc? Obviously, due to Deku already knowing Mirio in this arc, this means that the introduction of the big three and him obviously knowing them, in fact, even UA would know a couple of them already, this means that the introduction would be a little less about like them introducing themselves and more about Mirio attempting to prove a point to the students, showing them just how much of a difference there is between an experienced person and, well, them. So after Mirio would finish dismantling the entirety of Class 1A, we would see a meetup between Mirio, Deku, and even the Big Three, with them acknowledging that honestly it should be called the Big Four, what with Deku being as strong as he is. Mirio would ultimately end up telling Deku that seeing as he probably is already aware of the fact that they're going to have provisional, not provisional license exam, but hero work studies, he would end up inviting Deku to come and meet Sir Night-Eye, with Deku being like, honestly, I'm down. I mean, I already met Gran Torino, so it's about time that I meet the greatest sidekick to All Might there ever was. And so with that being the case, Mirio would smile as he would say, great, I'll let Sir Night-Eye know he was actually already expecting you, but I'll let him know. With Deku smiling, saying, yeah, I bet he was. This is when we would end up having the meetup between Sir Night-Eye and Deku playing out so much differently. Because in this timeline, Sir Night-Eye would have so much respect for Deku due to the fact that he uses his quirk, the fact that, he's acknowledged by All Might, and Mirio was the one that got one for all. So there would be like literally zero bad blood between them. And seeing as Light is the type of person who can probably get Sir Night-Eye to even crack a smile, we would end up having a really, really graceful meeting between the two, as Mirio and Deku would both be sent out on a little bit of a hero patrol, all the while Sir Night-Eye would finish up some paperwork from a previous hero incident. And with that being the case, Mirio and Deku would ultimately end up encountering Eri, which is where originally they let her go back to Overhaul, but due to the fact that this Mirio can clearly see the fear in Eri's eyes and knows that he can't call himself the successor of All Might if he's not willing to stand up for someone right in front of him, he would lunge into action, phasing into the ground at his maximum output of one for all the while in that moment, Izuku would cover the eyes of Eri and let out a blast of light so powerful that Overhaul was completely blinded by this, meaning that in the next split second, the dude would get absolutely ragdolled by a punch from Mirio, which not only manages to snap his arm, but even smashes a few ribs, tossing the villain into the wall as he would be completely unconscious and unaware of what's going on, meaning that by the time that he regains consciousness, the dude would be sedated and his quirk would be completely out of commission, meaning that the heroes would have successfully saved Eri without the whole convoluted plotline. And due to them capturing Overhaul and once now interrogating him, he would end up telling them everything they need to know in regards to Eri and her quirk use and all the horrible things he did to her, which ultimately leads Eri to once again fall into the care of Aizawa, with Deku and Mirio trying to, pretty much liven up the little girl's life who's obviously gone through so much, meaning that the Shiai Hisaikai raid would end up playing out so much smoother just because they're not specifically going after a target but everybody there, which means that every single fight that we get originally plays out nicely and we don't end up having the whole League of Villains encounter with Overhaul, meaning that we're able to just slowly get into the next part of the story, which would be the UA School Festival arc, which would end up playing out entirely different to the one in the original due to the fact that one thing would change. Deku wouldn't encounter Gentle Criminal early on. Instead, he would actually fully manage to break into UA, what with Labrava's help and his incurable quirk, which is actually pretty damn sick. He would end up making as a rival, but due to the fact that Deku would have the chance to spot the villain and so would the other heroes, they would end up pretty much just playing this out in a way that seems that this was all part of the plan and that he was just a hired actor, meaning that the festival arc wouldn't actually stop and UA would get to have the amazing day that they would in the original. And mind you, the reason that Deku would just most likely wouldn't meet Gentle Criminal is because of one reason. The dude has two consciousness practically reminding him to go get the rope, meaning he wouldn't have to go to the hardware store and he never runs into Gentle Criminal. But ultimately the arc is saved because I don't really want to have a story in which Eri's sad because bro, she already went through enough. And so we're able to just get into the next section of the story, which would happen a few months later in the joint training arc, which for those of you guys that don't really remember this part, because I ain't gonna lie, this is possibly one of the lamest sections in My Hero. It's basically like a 4v4 training arc where the student, it's kind of like the 2v2 battle pretty much. It's kind of literally the same thing, but it's in a different location, which strange to me considering the fact that it should have had the same impact that the first one had, but it just didn't. It completely just did not work. I feel like this arc could have been so freaking sick had Deku gone against Bakugo, Todoroki, Shinso, and like other members of Class 1B, where it was like a mixed training. Instead of Class 1A versus 1B, it was like 1A and 1B mixed together, where they have to like work alongside people they're not really too accustomed with. I don't know, maybe it's just me. But anyways, as soon as the match would begin, Izuku would turning towards his teammates would ask if it's okay if he goes all out for a second, with each of them kind of saying that it should be fine. Izuku almost immediately blitzing off, as we would see him appear behind the entirety of Class 1B and Shinso in Monoma, the girl with the red outfit. I forget her name, the little short dude, the girl who can like shrink and make things bigger. And so appearing right next to them all, Izuku immediately holding one hand out would end up shooting 5 separate light bullets towards the direction of their left ankles, each individually, leaving each of them to look down and assess the damage, as underneath their feet, their leg would suddenly be grabbed by a hand and start tugging at them, meaning that each of them were completely incapable of doing anything when the next attack would ultimately come, blinding them entirely, as they would feel the air around them like zooming by, almost as if they were like in a car with the windows down. But in reality, it was just Deku dragging them behind him using his darkness chain and throwing them inside of the cage, which pretty much means that the class would have won. And with everybody having watched that display of just absolute like just power, they would be shocked. Class 1B's teacher being like, "It's so unfair, Mr. Aizawa, that you have such an incredibly talented student on your roster. It just boils my blood." With Aizawa smirking, being like, "Yeah, and he's gone that strong without any real training." As we eventually get into what happens next, which would finally actually be the last arc in the story. What with the villain, what with the Meta Liberation arc happening and Shigaraki having his little upgrade moment happening, and then ultimately, you know, having the students go through the Endeavor Agency arc, which mind you is probably not going to be changing. That is if they even go with Endeavor, because realistically, I honestly kind of see a world in which Deku ends up actually going with Sir Night-Eye once again and spends his time with Mirio, which would really be the only change, meaning that the very, very last arc that we would get in the story would likely be the Paranormal Liberation War arc, in which Deku and Mirio would likely end up playing a massive part in the war due to the fact that the pro heroes can all easily acknowledge these guys are ready to be in the front lines with us. So being part of the initial raid that is made on the Jaku hospital, they would end up arriving and just getting to work. Mirio immediately using his quirk to take out a multitude of different villains, as Deku using his darkness quirk would just end up absolutely embarrassing a multitude of villains, eventually leading them to the final chamber in which All For One would be waiting for them, with Mirio, Mirko, and Deku being the first of all of them to finally having arrived. So with All For One understanding that the heroes came after him before his grand plan could finally come to succession, and that is in taking control of Shigaraki's body to finally face off against each of them and steal their quirks, we would end up getting a situation in which All For One would release every single high-end Nomu and send them after the group. It obviously being much more difficult for Mirko to handle it than for Deku and Mirio, but with Deku having his absolute like bringer of darkness technique, he would use it to perfection, blinding each and every one of the Nomus, as Deku, Mirko, and Mirio would end up landing devastating attacks on the Nomus, blowing their heads off and tearing the Nomus to shreds. Mirio doing this with a 70% one-for-all punch, which would just shatter the entirety of the building, creating rumblings to happen. Deku using his darkness quirk to actually hold up the building, all the while Mirio would lunge in at the direction of All For One, who reading her like a book would shoot tendrils out at her. But before that could happen, a light shield would appear, leaving Mirko to jump off of it and going, "Thanks, kid!" As going in and dropping a massive kick, All For One would be forced to actually create a barrier in front of him to stop it, which would create the perfect opening for Deku to appear under All For One, grabbing at his leg. Obviously, it would be like Deku's darkness clone, which I forgot to mention, that's like literally what's grabbing out, but due to the fact that it's only half of Deku that's like his darkness clone, it's kind of like a white Zetsu type thing where only half of its body's working, but it's still pretty cool and terrifying, as it would grab at All For One and end up wrapping himself around him, not allowing him to break free, giving Mirio the perfect opening to lunge in at All For One and land a devastating blow square to the face of All For One, who now, being completely out of commission thanks to that blow having nearly like straight up just blown up his head. This means that the heroes will all be successful, but due to the damage, this means that an electrical shock would end up setting off Shigaraki, because I mean, of course, we still want bro to get defeated fair and square. And once Shigaraki would end up waking up, the first thing the villain would do is place his hands on the ground, decaying the entirety of the hospital and killing a multitude of heroes, with Deku using his darkness quirk to hold himself up and Mirko, considering the fact that you can't decay darkness or light. And with that being the case, Shigaraki would smile to the direction of Mirio and Deku, who both now pissed off at the fact that multiple heroes' lives were lost. They would end up yelling out, "How could you?" as three voices practically would echo out in unison, and we would see a perfect combo-like attack landed on Shigaraki, Mirio appearing before him and landing a strike which would destroy Shigaraki's abdomen, sending him into the air, followed by a black whip-like chain grabbing at Shigaraki, dragging him down as an engulfed in light fist would then smash Shigaraki across the face, followed by a darkness claw which would leave a paralyzation attack, with Mirio then proceeding to land a barrage of blows to the direction of Shigaraki, similar to what Deku would have done to Overhaul in season 4. And after that final barrage would then be landed, Deku would aim his hand up at the sky as the rays of light coming off of the sun would end up turning into a little mini like beam of sun in his hands that he would end up tossing to the direction of Shigaraki, engulfing and destroying all of the impureness in Shigaraki's soul, quite literally performing like an exorcism on the dude practically, which would leave the original Tenko Shimura on the ground unconscious, leading to Deku and Mirio walking over him and saying that it's finally over. Deku and Mirio kind of having like a little bit of like a fist bump moment, as we would see the two of them later in the future, with each of them having become the respective number 1 and number 2 hero, with the rankings kind of shifting every week. One week it's Deku, another week it's Mirio, and it's all really just dependent on what incident was broadcasted and how many people they saved that day, which would end up turning into a pretty freaking sick dynamic, what with Mirio having one for all and Deku having pretty much the most busted half and half quirk in the series. And with that being said, I think that's a good spot where we could leave this little story off for now. Let me know what you guys thought about down below in the comments. If you guys were messing with that whole little launch, thing that I ended up incorporating into the story, I just thought it would be cool. And I even had another plot thread that I wanted to do in which Deku and, Dark and Light would end up like permanently fusing, but there was literally nobody in the My Hero Academia story, once I made him that powerful, that could have even possibly made it so that they had to do that. I mean, maybe if I gave Shigaraki New Order, but I mean, come on now, that's a bit of a stretch. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought about this one down below in the comments, and to the person who commissioned this video, thank you so much. I mean, it genuinely means the world. It helps me out pump a video, keeps me motivated, and most of all, helps your boy go out and, buy any random little things that he might want, like be it a hoodie, be it some grub, be it going out and watching a movie. Little things like that, they mean the world to me, and I genuinely do appreciate your support, bro. But without any further ado, it has been your boy Zether. I love each and every single one of you guys. Merry Christmas.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Like it or die!
That wasn't the line, Kachan!
Whatever!